The wagon lurched to a stop, and Eleanor Hayes stared at the man who was supposed to be her husband. Caleb Turner stood in the doorway of a collapsing ranch house, his eyes hollow with defeat. This wasn't the prosperous future she'd been promised. This was a graveyard of broken dreams. The land stretched barren and hostile around them, and somewhere in the darkness, creditors were already sharpening their knives. She had three choices: run back to the city, accept this disaster, or do something no one would expect. Eleanor chose war. Stay with me until the end of this story. Hit that like button and comment what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this journey travels. The November wind cut across the Nebraska prairie like a promise of suffering. Eleanor Hayes pressed her gloved hand against the wagon's wooden side, feeling every rattle and crack in her bones as the wheels churned through frozen mud. She'd been traveling for 6 days, first by train from Philadelphia, then by this cramped, uncomfortable wagon driven by a man who'd spoken maybe 20 words since picking her up from the depot in Grand Island. Through the canvas opening, she watched the landscape transform from the last struggling farms into something that looked like the edge of civilization itself. Endless grassland stretched in every direction, broken only by scattered clusters of cottonwood trees and the occasional abandoned homestead, their skeletal frames testimony to dreams that hadn't survived their first winter. She was 26 years old, unmarried, and until 3 months ago had been living in her brother's house in Philadelphia, teaching piano to children of merchants who looked at her with a mixture of pity and contempt. Poor Eleanor Hayes, past her prime, still dependent on family charity. The whispers had grown louder after her brother's wife gave birth to their 4th child. There simply wasn't room anymore. Not in the house, not in their lives, not in the narrow social circles that had already written her off as a spinster. The advertisement had appeared in the Philadelphia Inquirer on a Tuesday morning. Prosperous rancher in Nebraska Territory seeks educated wife. Must be of good character and willing to embrace frontier life. Ranch is well established with good prospects. Contact C. Turner, care of Grand Island Post Office. Eleanor had read it 3 times, her coffee growing cold in her cup. She'd heard the stories, of course, about mail-order brides heading west to marry strangers, about the disasters and occasional successes. But the word prosperous had caught her attention, and educated. That suggested a man who valued more than just domestic skills. She'd written that evening, carefully crafting a letter that was honest but not desperate. She described her education, her skills in household management and bookkeeping. Her father had been a merchant before his death, and she'd kept his accounts for years. She mentioned her age plainly, expecting it to be a disqualification. Caleb Turner's response had arrived 2 weeks later. The handwriting was rough but readable. Miss Hayes, your letter demonstrates the qualities I seek. I am 34 years old, owner of 640 acres of ranch land in Custer County. The work is hard but honest. I can offer you a home, security, and a partnership in building something lasting. If you are willing, I will send money for your passage. Partnership. That word had resonated with something deep in Eleanor's chest. Not a servant, not a dependent, a partner. She'd accepted. Now, 6 days later, watching the emptiness roll past, she wondered if she'd made the worst decision of her life. We're close now, the wagon driver finally spoke, his voice rough as gravel. Another hour, maybe. Eleanor straightened her traveling dress, dark blue wool, practical but still presentable, and checked that her hat was secure. First impressions mattered, even on the frontier, especially on the frontier. The sun was beginning its descent when the wagon crested a low hill, and she got her first view of what was supposed to be her new home. The ranch sprawled across a shallow valley, bounded on one side by a creek that looked barely more than a trickle. The main house was a 2-story structure that might have been impressive once, but now sagged visibly on one side, its paint peeled down to bare wood. Several outbuildings clustered nearby, a barn with gaps visible in its siding, a chicken coop that leaned at a dangerous angle, corrals made of mismatched fencing. A few cattle dotted the nearest pasture, maybe 30 head, all looking thin. The fields beyond showed the stubble of a failed harvest, and what might have once been an orchard was now just twisted, unpruned trees. Eleanor's stomach tightened. This wasn't prosperous. This was barely surviving. The wagon rolled down the rutted path toward the house. As they approached, a man emerged from the barn, tall and lean, moving with the stiff gait of someone who'd worked himself past exhaustion. He wore patched trousers and a shirt that had seen better years, his dark hair too long and his face shadowed by several days' worth of beard. Caleb Turner looked 10 years older than 34. The wagon stopped. The driver climbed down without ceremony and began unloading Eleanor's trunk, a single piece of luggage containing everything she owned. Caleb approached slowly, and Eleanor saw his eyes taking her in, assessment and something like resignation in his gaze. "Miss Hayes." His voice was deeper than she'd expected, roughened by prairie wind and strain. "I appreciate you coming all this way." Eleanor accepted his hand as he helped her down from the wagon, feeling the calluses and strength in his grip. Up close, she could see the lines of worry carved around his eyes, the tightness in his jaw. This was a man carrying weight that was crushing him. "Mr. Turner?" She kept her voice steady, refusing to let her dismay show. "I hope the journey wasn't inconvenient." "No inconvenience." He glanced at the house, then back at her. "I should be honest with you, Miss Hayes. Things here aren't... The letter I wrote might have given you the wrong impression." "About what, specifically?" He rubbed the back of his neck, a gesture of profound discomfort. "About prosperity. About security. About most things, I suppose." The wagon driver cleared his throat. "I'll be heading back now. Sun'll be down soon." Caleb pressed coins into the man's hand. Eleanor noticed how few there were, and the wagon rattled away, leaving them standing in the yard like two strangers at a funeral. "Would you like to see the house?" Caleb asked, but there was no enthusiasm in the question. Just duty. "I would." Eleanor picked up her skirts and followed him toward the sagging structure, her mind racing. The letter hadn't been deliberately deceptive. She could see that in his face. He'd written it hoping things would improve, believing in possibilities that hadn't materialized. Inside, the house was cleaner than she'd expected, but sparse to the point of emptiness. The front room held a worn sofa, a table with mismatched chairs, and little else. A cold fireplace dominated one wall. Dust motes danced in the fading light. "There's 2 bedrooms upstairs," Caleb said, not meeting her eyes. "You can have the larger one. I'll stay in the smaller. I thought we should get to know each other before making any formal arrangements." Eleanor set down her traveling bag and turned to face him fully. "Mr. Turner, perhaps we should dispense with polite evasions. What exactly is the situation here?" Something flickered in his eyes. Surprise. Maybe relief. He moved to the window, staring out at his failing ranch. "I'm 3 weeks from foreclosure. The bank in Grand Island holds a note for $800. I don't have it. I can't raise it. When they take this place, I'll have nothing." The number hit Eleanor like a physical blow. $800 was a staggering sum, more than most families saw in years. How did it get this bad? Drought hit us hard 2 years ago, lost most of the herd. Then last winter was brutal, lost most of what remained. Tried to make it up with crops, but the soil here needs more work than I understood. Bad luck, bad timing, bad decisions. He turned back to her, his expression bleak. "I shouldn't have written to you. Shouldn't have let you come here. I was desperate, and I made you part of that desperation. I'm sorry." Eleanor walked slowly around the room, her mind working. She'd come too far to simply turn around, and something in her, perhaps the same stubborn streak that had made her learn her father's business against all advice, that had made her reject the role of grateful dependent, something in her refused to accept this defeat. "Show me the books," she said. Caleb blinked. "What?" "Your financial records, accounts, expenses, debts, assets. Show me everything." "Miss Hayes, Eleanor, if we're being honest with each other, use my name, and I want to see your books." He stared at her for a long moment, as if trying to reconcile the proper Philadelphia lady with the woman demanding to review business accounts. Finally, he crossed to a battered desk in the corner and pulled out a leather-bound ledger, several loose papers, and what looked like official documents. Eleanor pulled out a chair and sat down, spreading the materials across the table. Caleb lit a lamp as the room darkened, then stood nearby, watching her with something between confusion and cautious hope. The ledger was a disaster. Entries sporadic, calculations questionable, entire months missing. But Eleanor had kept books for her father's import business for 5 years. She knew how to read between the numbers, how to spot patterns and possibilities. She worked in silence for nearly an hour, making notes on a blank page, cross-referencing documents, asking occasional questions that Caleb answered with increasing bewilderment. The house grew dark around them, and somewhere outside, cattle lowed plaintively. Finally, Eleanor sat back and looked up at him. "You're right that this is bad," she said, "but you're wrong that it's impossible." Caleb's laugh was bitter. "Miss Hayes, Eleanor, I appreciate the optimism, but I'm not being optimistic. I'm being analytical." She tapped the ledger. "You have 640 acres, which at 15 cents per acre represents $96 in theoretical land value. You have approximately 30 head of cattle, which even in their current condition represent at least $5 each. That's another $150. You have structures, equipment, and water rights along that creek, which have value even if they're not being properly utilized. None of that matters if I can't pay the note. Not immediately, no, but it demonstrates underlying assets that could be leveraged." Eleanor pulled out another document, the banknote. The original loan was for $600 taken out 3 years ago at 12% interest. You've made irregular payments, which is why the current balance has grown to $800. The terms allow the bank to foreclose after 90 days of non-payment, which is why you're facing this deadline. I know all this, but do you know that this document has irregularities? Eleanor pointed to specific clauses. The interest calculation appears to be compounded monthly rather than annually, which isn't standard practice and may not be legal under territorial law. And several of these fees, so she traced her finger down a list of charges. These aren't properly itemized or justified. Caleb leaned over her shoulder, reading. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying the bank may be overcharging you. I'm saying there might be grounds to challenge the foreclosure. And I'm saying that even if we can't challenge it, we might be able to negotiate better terms if we can demonstrate a viable recovery plan." "A recovery plan?" Caleb's voice was flat. "With what? Eleanor, I'm barely keeping us in food. I've got no capital, no credit, no prospects." Eleanor stood up and moved to the window, looking out at the darkened land. "You have land, water, and infrastructure. That's more than nothing. What you don't have is a strategy. I've tried everything. You've tried everything you know how to try." She turned back to him. "Mr. Turner, Caleb, I didn't come all this way to turn around at the first sign of trouble. If I wanted safety and comfort, I would have stayed in Philadelphia and accepted my brother's charity. I came here because you promised a partnership, so let me be a partner." Something shifted in his expression, the dullness of defeat cracking slightly, letting through a glimmer of something else. "You understand what you're proposing? This isn't about saving a ranch. This is about fighting a bank, probably a corrupt one, with almost no resources and almost no time." "I understand perfectly." Eleanor met his eyes steadily. "I'm proposing we do something neither of us can do alone. I'm proposing we stop accepting defeat and start creating possibilities. And I'm proposing we start tomorrow morning because we've already wasted today." Caleb studied her face in the lamplight. This proper Eastern woman with her upswept hair and travel-worn dress. This stranger who'd just arrived and was already talking about fighting impossible odds. Slowly, almost against his will, something like hope kindled in his chest. "All right," he said quietly. "All right. Tomorrow morning, we start." Eleanor nodded once, businesslike, then glanced around the sparse room. "For tonight, I should settle in, and we should eat something. I assume you have food?" "Some. Nothing fancy." "Fancy isn't what we need." She managed a slight smile. "We need fuel for thinking." They ate a simple meal of beans and bread at the scarred table, the lamp casting shadows that made the room feel smaller and more intimate than it should. Eleanor asked questions between bites, about the land, the cattle, the neighbors, the town. Caleb answered with growing engagement, finding himself explaining details he hadn't thought about in months. "The creek that runs along the eastern boundary," Eleanor asked, "does it ever run dry?" "Not completely. Even in the drought, there was some flow, but it gets low in late summer." "And the neighboring properties, who owns them?" Caleb's expression darkened. "To the west, that's Samuel Garrett's land. He's got about twice what I have, and he's been profitable even through the hard years. To the east is open range, but there's talk of it being claimed soon." "Samuel Garrett," Eleanor made a mental note. "What's your relationship with him?" He's made offers to buy me out. Low offers, but better than foreclosure. I turned him down because I'm stubborn, I suppose. This land was my father's. He died trying to make it work, and I thought I could honor that by succeeding where he couldn't. Eleanor heard the pain beneath the words. You're not your father's failure. You're your own person, facing your own challenges. Some days I wonder if there's a difference. They cleaned up in silence, and then Caleb showed her upstairs to the larger bedroom, a space with a bed, a dresser with a cracked mirror, and a window looking out over the dark prairie. Her trunk sat where he'd carried it up earlier. I'll be right across the hall, Caleb said from the doorway. If you need anything. Eleanor turned to face him. In the dim light, she could see past the exhaustion and defeat to the man underneath, someone who'd been carrying impossible weight alone for too long, who'd fought until he had nothing left, who'd reached out to a stranger because he literally had no other options. Caleb, she said quietly, thank you for being honest with me. A lot of men wouldn't have been. You deserve the truth, even if it means you'll leave on the next wagon. I'm not leaving. She said it firmly, making it a declaration. I came here for a partnership, and I intend to see it through. Whatever happens, we face it together. That's what partners do. Caleb looked at her for a long moment, and something in his expression shifted. A wall lowering, a door opening. I don't know if this can work, Eleanor. I don't know if we can beat the odds stacked against us. But I'm glad you're here. I'm glad I'm not alone in this anymore. Neither of us is alone. Not anymore. She offered her hand, formal and binding. Partners? He took it, his grip firm and warm. Partners. After he'd gone, Eleanor unpacked her few belongings and changed into her nightdress. She stood at the window for a long time, looking out at the stars that blazed across the huge Nebraska sky. Somewhere out there in the darkness was the town where the bank waited, the creditors who were counting down the days, the forces that wanted to crush this last desperate attempt at survival. She thought about the ledger downstairs, about the numbers that didn't quite add up, about the irregularities she'd spotted in the loan documents. She thought about water rights and untapped resources, about strategies her father had used when facing his own business crises. And she thought about the man across the hall, who'd been honest even when honesty cost him everything, who'd offered her a way out, even though it meant accepting his own destruction. Eleanor Hayes had come to Nebraska expecting to find a husband and a home. Instead, she'd found a war to fight and a partner to fight it with. The odds were terrible. The timeline was impossible. The consequences of failure were absolute. But as she finally climbed into the unfamiliar bed, listening to the wind howl across the prairie, Eleanor felt something she hadn't felt in years. A sense of purpose, of challenge, of mattering. Tomorrow, the battle would begin. The next morning arrived cold and crystalline, the sun rising over the prairie like a reluctant promise. Eleanor woke before dawn, dressed quickly in her most practical traveling outfit, and descended to find Caleb already up, a fire going in the kitchen stove. Coffee's almost ready, he said, looking surprised to see her so early. I thought you'd sleep in after the journey. We don't have time for sleeping in. Eleanor accepted a chipped mug of the bitter brew and took a fortifying sip. I want to walk the entire property today, all 640 acres. I need to see what we're actually working with. Caleb raised an eyebrow. That's a lot of ground to cover. We'll take most of the day. Then we should start now. They set out after a quick breakfast of oatmeal, Caleb leading the way across land he knew by heart. Eleanor walked beside him, asking constant questions, her sharp eyes cataloging everything. The ranch was laid out in a rough rectangle, bounded on the east by the creek Caleb had mentioned, and on the west by Garrett's property line, marked by a fence that was in much better repair than anything on Caleb's side. The northern boundary was marked by a rocky outcrop, and the southern edge ran up against open range. This was all grassland when my father claimed it, Caleb explained as they walked. He thought he could make it work with cattle alone, but the drought years taught me that putting all your resources into one thing is a death sentence out here. Eleanor nodded, her mind working. What about the orchard I saw yesterday? Those apple trees? My mother's project. She planted them 15 years ago before she died. I've let them go wild, too much work to maintain them when I was barely keeping the cattle alive. They reached the orchard, a sad collection of about 40 trees twisted and overgrown with neglect. Eleanor walked among them, examining the branches, the trunk conditions, the sparse remnants of the fall harvest rotting on the ground. Caleb, these trees are still producing. Barely, and the apples are small, wormy, not worth the effort to harvest. Eleanor picked up a fallen apple, cutting away the damaged portion with a small knife she'd brought. The flesh underneath was firm and tart. These could be processed: apple butter, dried fruit, cider. There's a market for preserved goods, especially heading into winter. I don't have equipment for processing, and even if I did, I don't have time to harvest and process. I'm already stretched too thin. What if we hired help? Caleb laughed, a sound without humor. With what money? With a share of the profits. Find someone willing to work for a percentage rather than wages. Someone who needs opportunity as much as we need labor. They continued walking, Eleanor's mind building a larger picture of possibilities. The creek was low but steady, enough to support small-scale irrigation if properly managed. The rocky northern section was useless for grazing but might have value for building materials. The southern range could potentially support more cattle if properly fenced and managed. Tell me about Samuel Garrett, Eleanor said as they approached the western boundary. Why is his ranch successful when yours is struggling? Caleb's jaw tightened. He's got more capital. He's been here longer, weathered the early hard years. And he's got connections, friends in the land office, in the bank. Things work out for him in ways they don't work out for people like me. Or he's smarter about leveraging his advantages. You admire him? I admire success. That doesn't mean I like how it's achieved. Eleanor stopped at the fence line, looking across at Garrett's property. She could see cattle in the distance, sleek and well-fed. A windmill turned lazily, pumping water. Has he ever offered to work with you rather than buy you out? No. Samuel Garrett doesn't work with people. He acquires them or crushes them. They walked the rest of the property in relative silence, Eleanor making mental notes, Caleb pointing out features and problems. By the time they returned to the house, the sun was past its peak, and Eleanor's feet ached in her impractical shoes. But her mind was racing. I need to go into town, she announced as they entered the house. Tomorrow. I need to see the bank, talk to merchants, understand the local economy. Caleb looked alarmed. Eleanor, the people at that bank, they're not going to be sympathetic. And if they know I've brought in someone to help fight them, it might make things worse. Then I won't tell them I'm your wife. I'll present myself as a business consultant, someone evaluating the ranch's viability, which is technically true. We're not married yet. You're thinking of lying to a bank? I'm thinking of not revealing information they're not entitled to. Eleanor met his eyes. Caleb, if we're going to win this, we need intelligence. We need to know what we're facing, who's behind it, what their real motivations are. Right now, we're fighting blind. He studied her face, this proper Eastern lady who was calmly proposing deception and strategic maneuvering. You're not what I expected, Eleanor Hayes. Good. If I was what people expected, I'd still be in Philadelphia teaching piano. She moved toward the stairs. I need to prepare for tomorrow. Find your best horse. I'll need transportation. That evening, Eleanor spent hours reviewing the documents again, making detailed notes, preparing questions. Caleb watched her work, fascinated by the intensity of her focus, the way she worried at problems like a terrier with a bone. My father taught me that most business problems aren't actually about money, Eleanor said without looking up. They're about information, timing, and leverage. If we can understand what the bank really wants and what they're afraid of, we might find room to maneuver. They want my land. Maybe. Or maybe they just want to be paid, and foreclosure is simply the easiest path. Or maybe there's something else going on, pressure from investors, political considerations, personal grudges. We won't know until we ask the right questions. And if they refuse to negotiate? Eleanor finally looked up, her eyes hard. Then we make them wish they had. The next morning, Eleanor dressed in her best outfit, a dark green traveling suit that managed to be both professional and feminine, her hair pinned up severely, her demeanor that of a woman who expected to be taken seriously. She looked like what she was claiming to be, a business consultant from the East, someone with education and authority. Caleb hitched up his most presentable horse to a small buggy. The bank is on Main Street. You can't miss it. Brick building. Looks more substantial than it has any right to. The banker you want is named Cyrus Blackwood. He's the one holding the note. Anything else I should know about him? He's smooth, friendly on the surface. Makes you feel like he's on your side right up until he destroys you. Caleb helped her into the buggy. Eleanor, be careful. These people are dangerous in ways you might not recognize. I spent years dealing with Philadelphia merchants who could smile while cutting your throat. I'll manage. She took the reins, feeling the horse's strength beneath her hands. I'll be back by nightfall. Hold things together here. The ride to Grand Island took nearly 2 hours, following a rutted road that ran parallel to the railroad tracks. Eleanor used the time to rehearse her approach, to settle into the role she was playing. She'd done this before, in a sense, walking into her father's business meetings, armed with knowledge and confidence, forcing men to take her seriously through sheer competence. Grand Island was larger than she'd expected, a real town with multiple streets, shops, a hotel, even a bank that looked substantial enough to justify Caleb's concern. The brick building occupied a prominent corner with gold lettering on the window, First Territorial Bank, Cyrus Blackwood, President. Eleanor tied up the buggy and entered with her shoulders back and her expression composed. Inside, the bank was all polished wood and leather chairs, designed to intimidate rural customers who were more comfortable in barns than boardrooms. A young clerk looked up from his desk. "May I help you, ma'am?" "I'm here to see Mr. Blackwood. My name is Eleanor Hayes. I'm conducting a business evaluation of the Turner Ranch property." She handed him a calling card she'd hastily made that morning, simple but professional. The clerk's eyebrows rose slightly. "Mr. Blackwood is quite busy." "I'm sure he is. I'm also sure he'll want to meet with someone assessing the viability of a property he's about to foreclose on. It affects his interests directly." She smiled coolly. "I can wait." The clerk disappeared through a door. Eleanor took the opportunity to study the bank, the layout, the other employees, the customers coming and going. Information was everywhere if you knew how to look for it. The clerk returned. "Mr. Blackwood will see you now." Cyrus Blackwood's office was exactly what Eleanor expected. Expensive furniture, a large desk, portraits of important men on the walls. The man himself was perhaps 50, well-dressed, with the kind of polished manner that spoke of someone who'd climbed to power through charm and ruthlessness in equal measure. "Miss Hayes?" He stood and offered his hand, his grip calculated to be firm but not aggressive. "This is an unexpected pleasure. Please, sit. Can I offer you tea?" "No, thank you. I prefer to keep this brief." Eleanor settled into the chair across from his desk, arranging her skirts. "I've been hired to evaluate the Turner Ranch property for potential investors. I understand you hold a substantial note on the land." Blackwood's smile didn't waver, but his eyes sharpened. "That's correct. Though I'm surprised Mr. Turner is entertaining investors at this late stage. The foreclosure deadline is quite imminent." Which is precisely why investors are interested. Distressed properties can represent significant opportunities for those with capital and vision. Eleanor pulled out a small notebook. "I'd like to understand the exact terms of the foreclosure. The property has certain irregularities that my clients find concerning." "Irregularities?" The smile tightened slightly. "The interest calculations, for one, and several fees that seem excessive or improperly documented. My clients are quite thorough in their due diligence. They wouldn't want to invest in a property with clouded title issues." Blackwood leaned back in his chair, his expression cooling. "Miss Hayes, I assure you that all of our documentation is perfectly in order. If Mr. Turner has been suggesting otherwise..." "Mr. Turner hasn't suggested anything. I'm conducting my own analysis based on the documents provided." Eleanor met his eyes steadily. "But I'm curious about your eagerness to foreclose rather than restructure. The underlying asset value significantly exceeds the debt, even in distressed condition. A bank concerned with maximizing return would typically negotiate before forcing a fire sale. The bank's concern is receiving payment on a long overdue obligation. Curious timing, though. The ranch has been struggling for 2 years, yet you've only recently accelerated foreclosure proceedings. What changed?" Blackwood's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Miss Hayes, I'm not sure what you're implying, but I'm not implying anything. I'm asking questions my clients expect answered before they commit capital." Eleanor flipped through her notebook. I'm also curious about the connection between this bank and Samuel Garrett. He's been making acquisition offers for the Turner property. Are those coordinated efforts? Absolutely not. But the denial came too quickly, too sharp. Eleanor made a note, letting the silence stretch. Finally, she looked up. Mr. Blackwood, my clients are prepared to invest in the Turner property's recovery, but they need assurances that the foreclosure can be prevented or delayed. What terms would the bank accept for restructuring the debt? Blackwood studied her carefully, reassessing. Your clients would need to demonstrate the ability to pay at least half the outstanding balance immediately, with the remainder restructured over no more than 18 months at prevailing interest rates. Well, half being $400. Correct. Eleanor wrote this down, her expression neutral. $400 was still an impossible sum, but it was less impossible than $800. And if those terms could be met, then the bank would be willing to discuss restructuring. But Miss Hayes, Blackwood leaned forward slightly, his voice taking on a harder edge. Let me be frank. The Turner Ranch has been a losing proposition for years. Your mysterious investors would be throwing good money after bad. There are better opportunities available. Such as? Such as working with established ranchers who actually know what they're doing. Samuel Garrett, for instance, has expressed interest in expanding his operations. He'd be a much safer investment than Turner's failing operation. There it was. The connection Eleanor had suspected. She kept her expression carefully neutral. I'll convey that to my clients, though they generally prefer undervalued assets to overpriced established operations. She stood, gathering her things. Thank you for your time, Mr. Blackwood. You've been most illuminating. Miss Hayes. Blackwood stood as well. Who exactly are these investors you represent? Eleanor smiled slightly. People with capital and vision, as I said. You'll meet them if the situation develops. She moved toward the door, then paused. One more question. If the Turner property goes to foreclosure, what's the bank's plan for disposing of it? That would depend on market conditions. Would Samuel Garrett be first in line to purchase? Blackwood's silence was answer enough. Eleanor left the bank with her mind racing, pieces clicking into place. This wasn't just about debt collection. It was about land acquisition, about Garrett expanding his empire, about a corrupt banker helping a wealthy rancher crush competition. The foreclosure was the means, not the end. She spent the rest of the afternoon in town, talking to merchants, listening to gossip, gathering information. The picture that emerged confirmed her suspicions. Garrett was the most powerful man in the county, with his fingers in every profitable enterprise. The bank was essentially his tool, and small ranchers like Caleb were being systematically squeezed out. But information was power, and Eleanor had just gained a lot of information. She returned to the ranch as the sun was setting, finding Caleb anxiously waiting in the yard. He helped her down from the buggy, his eyes searching her face. Well, we're not fighting a bank, Eleanor said. We're fighting a conspiracy, but that actually gives us more options than I thought. Inside, over a hastily prepared dinner, Eleanor laid out everything she'd learned. Blackwood's connection to Garrett, the coordinated effort to acquire the land, the fact that the bank would be willing to restructure if they could raise $400 immediately. $400 is still impossible, Caleb said, but there was less defeat in his voice now. But it's less impossible than $800. Exactly. Eleanor pulled out her notes. And now we know what we're really up against. This isn't about a failed ranch. This is about Garrett trying to monopolize the best ranch land in the county, using the bank as his weapon. That means he has vulnerabilities too. Such as? Such as the fact that his empire is built on reputation and relationships. If we can damage those, we can hurt him. And if we can demonstrate that the foreclosure is being conducted improperly, which I believe we can, we might be able to delay or even stop it, buying ourselves time to execute a recovery plan. Caleb was staring at her with something like awe. Eleanor, you went into that town for the first time this morning, and you've already figured out the whole power structure. Information is easy to gather if you know what to look for and who to ask. The hard part comes next, turning information into action. Eleanor stood and moved to the window, looking out at the darkening land. We need to do 3 things simultaneously. First, we need to find a way to raise immediate capital, even if it's just partial payment to demonstrate good faith. Second, we need to document the irregularities in the foreclosure and prepare a legal challenge. Third, we need to make this ranch show profit quickly enough to prove it's viable. All in 3 weeks. All in 3 weeks. Eleanor turned back to him. So we start tomorrow. We harvest those apples and find a way to sell them. We identify every asset on this property that can be monetized. We talk to a lawyer about the foreclosure documents, and we make Samuel Garrett and Cyrus Blackwood regret that they ever tried to crush Caleb Turner. Caleb stood and crossed to where she stood. In the lamplight, Eleanor could see that the defeat in his eyes had been replaced by something fiercer, determination, maybe even hope. I don't know if this can work, he said quietly, but I know I wouldn't have tried it alone. Thank you, Eleanor, for seeing possibilities where I could only see endings. We're partners, Eleanor said simply. That means we see things the other can't see. Together, we're stronger than either of us could be alone. They stood there in the quiet house, two people who'd been strangers a day ago, now bound together in a desperate fight against impossible odds. Outside, the prairie wind howled its eternal song of hardship and survival. The war had begun. Dawn broke cold and urgent over the Turner Ranch, and Eleanor was already dressed and downstairs before the first light touched the kitchen windows. She'd slept poorly, her mind churning through calculations and strategies, but exhaustion was a luxury they couldn't afford. Caleb emerged from his room looking equally sleepless, his hair still damp from washing at the pump. Coffee first, he said, moving toward the stove. Then war. Eleanor managed a tight smile. I've been thinking about the apples. We need to move fast. If we wait much longer, they'll be completely worthless. Do you know anyone in town who might work for a share of profits rather than wages? Caleb poured 2 cups of the bitter brew, considering. There's a widow, Martha Jensen. Her husband died 2 years ago, left her with 3 kids and a failing homestead about 5 miles south. She's been doing whatever work she can find. Washing, cooking, anything. Would she know how to process apples? Her mother ran a cannery back in Ohio. Martha grew up making preserves. He handed Eleanor her cup. But she's proud, won't accept charity. I'm not offering charity. I'm offering partnership. Eleanor took a long drink, feeling the heat cut through the morning chill. 30% of whatever we make from the apple harvest. She provides labor and expertise. We provide the raw materials and access to markets. Fair deal for everyone. If there's anything to make, there will be. We'll make sure of it. Eleanor set down her cup decisively. You ride to Martha Jensen's place this morning. Explain the arrangement. Meanwhile, I'll inventory everything we have that could be used for processing. Jars, equipment, storage. We'll need to work fast once she agrees. Caleb studied her over his coffee, still adjusting to this whirlwind of activity, this sudden transformation from solitary defeat to coordinated campaign. You're sure about this? About all of it? I'm not sure about anything except that doing nothing guarantees failure. At least this way we're fighting. Eleanor moved to the window, watching the sky lighten over the struggling ranch. While you're gone, I'm also going to survey what else we can monetize quickly. That old equipment in the barn, is any of it worth selling? Most of it's junk, but there's a seed drill my father bought that I've never used. Might be worth $20 to someone with better soil than ours. $20 is $20. What about the cattle? Could we sell a few head for quick cash without crippling the herd? Caleb's expression darkened. The herd's already crippled. Selling more would just be admitting defeat. It's not defeat if it's strategic. Eleanor turned to face him. Caleb, we need to think differently about everything. Those cattle aren't sacred. They're assets that can be converted to capital we desperately need. If selling 5 head means we keep the land and can rebuild a better herd later, that's not defeat. That's survival. He was quiet for a long moment, wrestling with pride and pragmatism. Finally, he nodded slowly. You're right. There's a cattle buyer comes through Grand Island every few weeks. Due back in about 10 days. I could get maybe $25 per head for the 5 best. That's $125. Combined with whatever we make from apples, the seed drill, and anything else we can find, we might be able to scrape together enough for a significant payment to the bank. Eleanor grabbed her shawl. But we need to start now. Every day we wait is a day closer to foreclosure. They split up after a quick breakfast of yesterday's bread and bitter coffee, Caleb saddling his horse for the ride to Martha Jensen's homestead, while Eleanor began a systematic inventory of every building, every piece of equipment, every possible asset on the property. The morning air was sharp enough to hurt, winter announcing its intentions, and Eleanor pulled her shawl tighter as she worked. The barn was a treasure trove of neglect. Tools rusted from disuse, equipment half repaired and abandoned, old harnesses and tack that might have value if properly cleaned and mended. Eleanor made careful notes of everything, her practical merchant's eye assessing each item's potential worth. The seed drill Caleb mentioned was indeed substantial, clearly well made even under its coating of dust and spiderwebs. $20 seemed reasonable, maybe even conservative. She was examining a stack of unused fence posts when she heard a horse approaching at speed. Eleanor emerged from the barn to see a man on a fine bay gelding riding up the path, well-dressed for the frontier, his horse's tack expensive, his bearing that of someone accustomed to authority. Samuel Garrett. Eleanor recognized him immediately, though they'd never met. This was the man at the center of the conspiracy, the empire builder using Blackwood's bank to crush his competition. "Morning," Garrett called out, dismounting with easy confidence. He was perhaps 45, handsome in a weathered way, his eyes sharp and assessing. "You must be the Lady Turner brought in from back east. Eleanor Hayes, isn't it?" Eleanor was instantly wary of how much he already knew. "Mr. Garrett, I presume. Word travels quickly out here." "Small community. People talk." He smiled, but there was calculation behind it. "I was hoping to speak with Caleb. Business matter." "He's not here at the moment. Can I help you?" Garrett's eyes swept over the ranch, the sagging buildings, the thin cattle, all the visible signs of struggle. "I'll be direct, Miss Hayes. I know about the foreclosure. I know Caleb's situation is desperate. I've made him fair offers before, but he's too stubborn to accept reality. Maybe you can talk sense into him." "What kind of offers?" "I'll pay off the bank note completely and give him an additional $200 for clear title to this land. That's more than generous for a failing ranch." Garrett stepped closer, his voice taking on a tone of practiced reasonableness. "Look around, Miss Hayes. This place is dying. Caleb's drowning. The kindest thing would be to let him walk away with something rather than lose everything to the bank." Eleanor met his eyes steadily. "That's interesting, Mr. Garrett, because the land alone is worth more than $800, even without improvements. So you're essentially offering to acquire over 600 acres for less than it's worth, plus structures, water rights, and equipment. That's not generous. That's opportunistic." Garrett's smile hardened slightly. "You've got a sharp tongue for someone who just arrived, but you don't understand how things work out here. This land has broken better men than Caleb Turner. Whatever romantic notions you've got about frontier partnership, reality's going to crush them soon enough." "Perhaps. Or perhaps I understand more than you think." Eleanor crossed her arms. "I know about your relationship with Cyrus Blackwood. I know the foreclosures being accelerated to benefit your land acquisition strategy. And I know that if this was truly a legitimate business transaction, you wouldn't be here trying to pressure a decision while Caleb's away." Garrett's expression went cold, the pretense of friendliness evaporating. "Careful, Miss Hayes. You're making accusations that could be considered slanderous. I'm stating observations, but since we're being direct, let me ask you something. Why do you want this land so badly? Your ranch is already twice the size, and this property's in poor condition. What's the real value you're seeing?" For a moment, Garrett seemed to consider whether to answer. Then he shrugged, apparently deciding there was no harm in truth since he thought he'd already won. "The creek. Reliable water is worth more than gold out here, and that creek runs year-round. With proper management and my capital, this land could support 3 times the cattle it does now. Combined with my existing operation, I'd control the best water access in the county." "So you're willing to destroy a man's life for water rights?" "Well, I'm willing to acquire valuable assets through legal means. If Caleb can't hold on to his land, that's not my fault. It's his failure." Garrett moved back toward his horse. "But I'll tell you this as a courtesy. The bank will foreclose in 3 weeks. When they do, I'll be first in line to purchase at auction. You'd be smart to convince Caleb to take my offer now, while he can still walk away with something." "We'll take our chances." Garrett mounted smoothly, looking down at her from horseback. "Your choice. But when this falls apart, and it will, don't say you weren't warned." He touched his hat in mock politeness. "Good day, Miss Hayes. I'm sure we'll speak again soon. Eleanor watched him ride away, her mind racing. The conversation had confirmed everything she'd suspected and revealed something new. The creek was the real prize, the underlying asset that made this dying ranch worth fighting over. Water rights in a drought-prone territory were indeed more valuable than gold. She was still standing in the yard when Caleb returned an hour later, his expression cautiously optimistic. He dismounted quickly when he saw her face. What happened? Samuel Garrett paid us a visit, made threats disguised as offers, confirmed he's working with Blackwood to steal this land, and inadvertently revealed why he wants it so badly. Eleanor quickly recounted the conversation as they walked toward the house. The creek is the key, Caleb. The water rights are what he's really after. Caleb's expression grew thoughtful. That makes sense. He's been trying to expand his cattle operation, but his main water source is a spring that runs low in summer. Access to reliable creek water would solve that problem. Which means we need to protect those water rights at all costs. Eleanor pulled out her notebook. Can he access the creek from his property? No, the creek runs entirely along my eastern boundary. The only way he gets water rights is if he owns the land. Then that's our leverage. As long as we hold this property, he can't execute his expansion plans. Eleanor made notes. What about Martha Jensen? Caleb's expression brightened slightly. She's interested, more than interested. She practically jumped at the opportunity. She'll start tomorrow morning, bring her 2 oldest kids to help with the harvest. They'll work from dawn to dusk until we've processed everything that's salvageable. Good. That's one piece moving in the right direction. Eleanor glanced toward the orchard. We should start preparing the processing area today. What do we have for equipment? They spent the rest of the morning transforming a corner of the barn into a makeshift processing facility. Caleb had an old copper kettle his mother had used for rendering lard that could be repurposed for cooking down apples. Eleanor found barrels that could be cleaned and used for storage, and a stack of glass jars, fewer than she'd hoped for, but enough to start. While they worked, Eleanor's mind kept returning to the larger problem. Even if they successfully processed and sold the apple harvest, even if they got good money for the cattle and the seed drill, they'd still fall short of $400. They needed another angle, another source of revenue, or another way to buy time. Caleb, tell me about the rocky area on the northern boundary, she said, scrubbing out a jar. You mentioned it was useless for grazing, but is there anything else up there? Just rocks and scrub brush. My father thought there might be minerals worth mining, but he never found anything valuable. Why? Because unusable land might have uses we haven't considered, building materials, for instance. If there's good quality stone, it could be quarried and sold. Eleanor set down the clean jar. I want to ride up there this afternoon. Take a closer look. Eleanor, we don't have time to start a quarrying operation. I'm not suggesting we quarry anything ourselves, but if there's valuable stone there, it's another asset we could potentially sell rights to or leverage somehow. We need to know everything this land can offer. Caleb wiped his hands on a rag, studying her with an expression mixing admiration and concern. You don't stop, do you? Don't ever just accept what seems obvious. If I accepted what seemed obvious, I'd still be in Philadelphia teaching piano to ungrateful children. The obvious is usually wrong, or at least incomplete. Eleanor moved toward the barn door. Show me the northern boundary, then we'll know if it's worth considering. They rode out after a quick meal, following a rough path that led toward the rocky outcrop visible from the house. The land here was indeed poor, shallow soil over limestone bedrock, supporting only tough prairie grass and stubborn scrub. As they climbed higher, the rocks became more prominent, until they were riding through an area where exposed stone jutted up in broken formations. Eleanor dismounted and walked among the rocks, running her hands over the surfaces, examining the grain and quality. She wasn't an expert in geology, but her father had dealt in building materials, and she'd learned enough to recognize decent limestone when she saw it. This is good stone, she said. Not exceptional, but solid. There's a market for limestone in the growing towns, building foundations, walls, even decorative work. She turned to Caleb. Has anyone ever approached you about stone rights? No. Like I said, my father looked for ore, didn't find any, and that was the end of it. Eleanor climbed higher toward the largest outcrop. From this vantage point, she could see across both Caleb's ranch and Garrett's property to the west. Garrett's land was visibly more prosperous, better maintained fences, healthier cattle, a substantial house with outbuildings in good repair. The contrast was stark and humiliating. But as Eleanor studied the landscape, something else caught her attention. The creek that ran along Caleb's eastern boundary appeared to originate somewhere in the broken hills further east, probably fed by underground springs. But from this height, she could see what wasn't obvious from ground level. The natural drainage patterns suggested that with minimal work, water could potentially be redirected or additional access points created. "Caleb, come up here." He climbed to join her, following her pointing finger as she traced the landscape features. "Look at how the land slopes. The creek's natural flow moves through our property, but see there, where it curves near Garrett's western fence? That's the closest it gets to his land, maybe 50 yards from his boundary. So if he could extend his fence line to reach the creek, he'd have the water access he wants without buying your entire ranch. But he can't extend his fence onto your property without permission." Eleanor turned to him. "Unless he thought he could acquire an easement or right-of-way somehow. Has he ever asked about that?" "Never directly, but about 6 months ago, he suggested we might cooperate on shared water access during drought years. I turned him down because I didn't trust his motives." "Good instinct. Because an easement for water rights would devalue your land and give him exactly what he wants without the full cost of acquisition." Eleanor made mental notes. That's why he's so intent on full ownership. He needs complete control to execute his plans. They were descending the rocky slope when Eleanor's horse stumbled slightly, dislodging a piece of stone. She dismounted to check the animal's hoof, and as she did, something about the exposed rock face caught her eye. The stone here had a different quality, slightly crystalline, with a subtle sparkle when the afternoon sun hit it at the right angle. Eleanor broke off a small piece and examined it closely. She was no geologist, but this didn't look like ordinary limestone. It looked like something else, something that might actually have value beyond building materials. "Caleb, did your father have this area assayed by an actual expert?" "He panned for gold in the creek, dug some exploratory holes. Never found anything worth pursuing." "But did he have the rock itself analyzed by someone who knew what they were looking for?" Eleanor pocketed the sample. "Because this doesn't look like plain limestone to me. I want to take this to Grand Island, find someone who can tell us what it actually is." "Eleanor, we can't afford to chase wild speculation." "I'm not chasing anything. I'm being thorough. If this is nothing, we've lost an hour. If it's something, it could change everything." She mounted her horse. "Besides, I need to go to town tomorrow anyway. I want to find a lawyer, someone who can review the foreclosure documents and advise us on legal strategy." They rode back as the sun began its descent, the air growing colder. Eleanor's mind was already 3 steps ahead, planning the next day's activities, calculating probabilities and possibilities. Behind them, the mysterious rock outcrop stood silent against the darkening sky, holding secrets that might be worthless or invaluable. That evening, they worked late preparing for Martha Jensen's arrival the next morning. Caleb sharpened knives for peeling and cutting, while Eleanor organized the work area and made lists of supplies they'd need. Sugar for preserving, more jars if they could afford them, fuel for keeping fires going during the long processing hours. "We should think about markets too," Eleanor said, writing by lamplight. "Who buys preserved goods in Grand Island? What's the going rate? Can we get premium prices if the quality's exceptional? There's a general store that stocks preserves, and the hotel might buy apple butter for their dining room. But Eleanor, even if we sell everything we make, we're talking about maybe $50 or $60 total. That's not enough to make a real difference." By itself, no. But combined with the cattle sale, the seed drill, and whatever else we can generate, it adds up. Every dollar we can present to the bank is a dollar that strengthens our negotiating position. Eleanor looked up from her notes. "And there's something else I've been thinking about. What if we could convince other struggling ranchers to combine resources for a collective negotiation with the bank?" Caleb frowned. "What do you mean?" "I mean, Blackwood and Garrett are probably running this same scheme on multiple properties. If we could organize the other victims, present a unified front, we might have enough leverage to force the bank to negotiate fairly with all of us." Eleanor's eyes grew intense. Divide and conquer works both ways. Right now, they're picking us off one by one, but if we band together, we become much harder to destroy. That's ambitious. Most of the small ranchers around here are barely hanging on. They're not going to have energy for organizing resistance. Then we make it easy for them. We do the organizing work. We present a clear plan that benefits everyone. Eleanor stood and paced, her mind racing. But first, we need to stabilize our own situation. We can't recruit allies when we're on the edge of collapse ourselves. One crisis at a time. Martha Jensen arrived shortly after dawn the next morning, driving a rickety wagon with her two oldest children, a boy of about 14 and a girl maybe 12, both wearing clothes patched so many times that little of the original fabric remained. Martha herself was perhaps 35, work-worn, but with sharp, intelligent eyes that took in the ranch's condition with a single, sweeping glance. "Mr. Turner, Miss Hayes." Her voice was brisk, no nonsense. "My children are Emma and Jacob. They're good workers, won't need constant supervision." "Where's this orchard?" Eleanor liked her immediately. "I'll show you. We've set up a processing area in the barn, and Caleb's bringing up water from the creek. The trees are overgrown, and the apples are mixed quality, but there's more salvageable fruit than we initially thought." Martha walked through the orchard with a professional eye, examining trees, picking up fallen apples, assessing the situation. "We'll need to sort carefully. The best fruit will preserve whole or slice for drying. Medium quality goes to apple butter. Poor quality gets pressed for cider if you've got equipment, otherwise composted. Nothing gets wasted." "How long will processing take?" "With 3 of us working steady, maybe 4 days to harvest and process everything here. Depends on how many trees are actually producing." Martha turned to her children. "Emma, you'll handle washing and sorting. Jacob, you're on harvest. Get every piece of fruit that's worth saving. We work until dark, understand?" They nodded silently, already moving toward the trees with practiced efficiency. This family knew how to work, knew how to survive through sheer stubborn effort. While Martha and her children began the harvest, Eleanor prepared for her trip to Grand Island. She had the rock sample in her pocket, along with a list of questions for a lawyer and names of potential buyers for preserved goods. Caleb had insisted she take his best horse again, despite his need for the animal on the ranch. "Be careful," he said as he helped her mount. "Garrett knows you went to the bank yesterday. He'll be watching, trying to figure out what we're planning." "Let him watch. Everything we're doing is legal and above board." Eleanor settled into the saddle. "I'll be back by evening. Hold things together here." The ride to Grand Island was becoming familiar, the landscape less alien than it had seemed just days ago. Eleanor used the time to refine her strategy. She needed to find a lawyer who was both competent and willing to work for contingency payment. They couldn't afford hourly fees. She needed to identify the best markets for the Apple products. And she needed to get that rock sample analyzed by someone who actually knew what they were looking at. Grand Island was busier on this morning, with farmers' wagons crowding the main street and townspeople moving with purposeful energy. Eleanor tied her horse outside the general store and entered, immediately struck by the contrast with Philadelphia's well-stocked shops. Here, inventory was sparse and practical: tools, dry goods, basic clothing. No luxuries, no ornamentation. The proprietor was a weathered man in his 50s who looked up from his inventory with automatic courtesy. "Help you, ma'am?" "I hope so. I'm looking to sell preserved apple products, butter, whole preserves, possibly dried fruit. High-quality goods. Are you interested in stocking local production?" The man's expression sharpened with interest. "Might be. Martha Jensen used to supply me before her husband died. Best apple butter in the territory, but I haven't seen her in over a year. She's working with me now. We'll have product ready within a week." Eleanor pulled out her notebook. "What prices do preserved goods fetch here?" They negotiated for 10 minutes, Eleanor drawing on every skill her father had taught her about commodity trading. The proprietor tried to lowball her, claiming market conditions were poor, but Eleanor had done her research and knew what prices were reasonable. They finally settled on terms that would net 50 cents per jar of preserves, 75 cents for apple butter, and $1.50 for dried fruit. "I'll take whatever you can produce," the proprietor said, "but I'll need to see quality before committing to specific quantities." "You'll get quality. Martha Jensen's work backed by my standards." Eleanor shook his hand firmly. "We'll deliver the first batch within 10 days. Next, Eleanor sought out the hotel Caleb had mentioned, a two-story establishment that catered to railroad travelers and the occasional businessman passing through. The manager, a fastidious man named Harrison, was skeptical until Eleanor described the products and mentioned Martha Jensen's reputation. Mrs. Jensen's preserves were exceptional, Harrison admitted. If you can match that quality, I'd be interested in purchasing for the hotel dining room. We're trying to establish a reputation for serving the finest local ingredients. They negotiated prices slightly higher than the general store, contingent on consistent quality and reliable delivery. Eleanor left with a verbal commitment for at least 30 jars monthly, more if the product sold well to hotel guests. 2 markets secured, Eleanor turned her attention to the rock sample. She found the assayer's office on a side street, a small cluttered space smelling of chemicals and old paper. The assayer himself was an elderly man with thick spectacles and ink-stained fingers, introduced as Howard Finch. "I need this rock analyzed," Eleanor said, producing her sample. "I want to know exactly what it is, what it might be worth, and whether there's likely to be more where it came from." Finch took the sample, turning it over in practiced hands, then scrutinizing it through a magnifying lens. His expression shifted from routine boredom to sudden intensity. "Where did you get this?" "From a rocky outcrop on ranch land in Custer County." "Why? Is it valuable?" "Might be. This shows characteristics consistent with lead-zinc mineralization. See these crystals? That's galena, lead sulfide. The sparkle you're seeing is probably sphalerite, zinc sulfide." Finch looked up sharply. "If there's a significant deposit, this could be worth considerable money. Mining operations are crying out for lead right now, and zinc has good market value too." Eleanor's heart began to race, but she kept her expression carefully neutral. "How would I determine if there's a significant deposit?" "You'd need a proper geological survey. I could do a preliminary assessment for $50, test multiple samples, evaluate the site, give you a professional opinion on whether it's worth pursuing further development." $50 they didn't have. But if Finch's preliminary assessment showed real potential, that information itself had value that could be leveraged with investors or used as collateral for better loan terms. "I'll need to discuss this with my business partner," Eleanor said. "How quickly could you conduct the assessment once commissioned?" 2 days on site, another 2 for analysis and report. So about a week total from authorization. Eleanor thanked him and left, her mind spinning with possibilities. If the rocky area actually contained valuable mineral deposits, the entire situation transformed. The land wasn't just worth defending. It was potentially worth far more than anyone had realized. That changed calculations dramatically. But she forced herself to stay grounded. The minerals might not pan out. The deposit might be too small or too difficult to extract profitably. They couldn't bet everything on speculation. The apple processing, the cattle sale, the legal challenge to the foreclosure, those remained the foundation of their survival strategy. Her final stop was the lawyer's office. Eleanor had gotten a name from the general store proprietor, Matthias Cole, described as honest and competent, which in frontier territories was a rare combination. His office was above a dry goods store, accessed by an external staircase that creaked alarmingly under Eleanor's weight. Cole himself was younger than she'd expected, perhaps 30, with earnest eyes and nervous hands. He stood quickly when she entered, clearly unaccustomed to female clients conducting business independently. "Miss Hayes, please sit. How can I assist you?" Eleanor produced the foreclosure documents and the loan agreement, spreading them across his desk. "I need these reviewed for irregularities, improper procedures, anything that could form the basis for a legal challenge. The property owner is 3 weeks from foreclosure, so time is critical." Cole bent over the documents, his initial nervousness giving way to focused concentration as he read. Minutes passed in silence, broken only by the scratch of his pen as he made notes. Finally, he looked up, his expression troubled. "There are definitely problems here. The interest calculations are questionable. The compounding method doesn't match standard territorial banking practices. Several fees appear to be inflated or improperly applied, and the acceleration of foreclosure seems to lack proper documentation of default notices." He tapped one particular clause. "This provision here, requiring full payment within 30 days of acceleration notice, that's almost certainly unenforceable under territorial law. Standard practice requires 90 days minimum." Eleanor leaned forward. "Could we challenge the foreclosure on these grounds?" Possibly, but challenges take time, filing motions, scheduling hearings, waiting for judicial review. Even if you win eventually, the bank could argue that the debt remains valid regardless of procedural irregularities, meaning the property owner would still need to pay. Cole looked at her seriously. Your best strategy might be using these irregularities as leverage for negotiation rather than formal challenge. Threaten to expose the bank's questionable practices publicly if they won't restructure the debt on reasonable terms. Blackmail. Aggressive negotiation, Cole corrected with a slight smile. Banks rely on reputation. If word spreads that First Territorial is conducting foreclosures improperly, their entire business suffers. They'll want to avoid that scrutiny if possible. Eleanor considered this. What would you charge to draft a letter to the bank outlining the irregularities and demanding debt restructuring? Normally $50, but if you're willing to wait on payment until the situation resolves, I'd do it for $75, contingent on successful outcome. Done. Eleanor extended her hand. Draft the letter immediately. I want it delivered to Cyrus Blackwood within 2 days. They shook on it, and Eleanor left with renewed determination. The pieces were falling into place. The apple harvest was underway. Markets were secured. The legal challenge was being prepared. The potential mineral value was being investigated. Every angle was being pressed, every possibility explored. She rode back to the ranch as evening approached, finding the property transformed by purposeful activity. In the orchard, Martha and her children were still working by fading light, filling basket after basket with sorted apples. In the barn, Caleb had fires going under the copper kettle, and the air smelled of cooking fruit. Eleanor dismounted and immediately joined the work, rolling up her sleeves and taking a position beside Emma at the sorting table. The girl looked surprised but appreciative, and they fell into a rhythm, examining each apple, making split-second decisions about quality and destination. Your mother's an impressive woman, Eleanor said quietly as they worked. Emma nodded. She's kept us alive since Pa died. Most people thought she'd lose the homestead and have to move to town, maybe take in laundry or work as a cook. But Ma said we'd make it work somehow. She reminds me that strength comes in many forms. Eleanor placed a particularly good apple in the preserve basket. How are you finding the work here? It's good. Feels like we're building something, not just scraping by. Emma glanced at her mother, working tirelessly several yards away. Ma hasn't looked this focused in months. Having a real project, real partnership, it matters to her. Eleanor understood. It mattered to her too, this sense of purpose and shared struggle. She'd spent years existing on the margins of other people's lives, never quite belonging, never quite essential. Here, every decision she made had weight and consequence. Here, she mattered. They worked until full darkness made further harvesting impossible, then gathered in the barn for a late meal of bread and soup. Caleb had managed to keep the processing fires going all day, and already they had several barrels of rough-cut apples ready for the next stage of preservation. Tomorrow we start the actual cooking and preserving, Martha said, exhaustion evident in her voice, but satisfaction too. We'll work in shifts, someone always tending the kettle, someone washing jars, someone monitoring quality. It's going to be brutal, but we'll get through it. After Martha and her children had departed in their wagon, Eleanor and Caleb sat at the kitchen table, reviewing the day's progress. Eleanor reported on her meetings in town, the market secured, the lawyer engaged, the potential mineral discovery. Caleb's eyes widened when she described Finch's assessment of the rock sample. You're saying there might actually be valuable minerals up there. All these years, we thought it was worthless. Maybe, maybe not. We won't know until there's a proper survey, but even the possibility has value. It's leverage we didn't have yesterday. Eleanor rubbed her tired eyes. The question is whether we mention it to the bank during negotiations or keep it as backup information. If we tell them, won't they just factor it into the foreclosure value, make it even harder for us to keep the land? Possibly. But if they don't know about it and we're forced into foreclosure anyway, Garrett ends up getting minerals worth far more than he's paying. At least if we disclose, we might be able to negotiate better terms. Eleanor sighed. It's a calculated risk either way. They sat in tired silence, the weight of impossible decisions pressing down on them. Outside, the prairie wind howled its eternal song. And somewhere in the darkness, Samuel Garrett was probably planning his next move, confident that time and economics were on his side. But what Garrett didn't understand, what people like him never understood, was that desperation could be its own form of power. When you had nothing left to lose, you could take risks that more comfortable people wouldn't dare. You could fight with intensity born of pure necessity. Eleanor looked across the table at Caleb, seeing the exhaustion in his face, but also something new, a glimmer of belief that maybe, just maybe, they could actually win this impossible fight. 3 weeks, she said quietly. We've got 3 weeks to generate capital, prepare legal challenges, process and sell the apple harvest, and somehow convince a corrupt bank to restructure debt. They have no reason to restructure. It's impossible. Completely impossible, Caleb agreed. They looked at each other and slowly, almost against their will, they both smiled. The grim, determined smiles of people who'd decided to fight the impossible anyway. Then we'd better get started, Eleanor said, and Caleb nodded. And together they bent back over their plans and calculations, two partners plotting their war against a world that thought it had already defeated them. Outside, the stars blazed cold and indifferent over the struggling ranch, bearing witness to yet another desperate gamble in the endless human struggle for survival and dignity. The night deepened, and still the lights burned in the Turner house, illuminating two figures working late into darkness, refusing to accept defeat, refusing to surrender to the obvious impossibility of their situation. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new crises, new impossible demands. But tonight, they had a plan. Tonight, they had each other. Tonight, they were still fighting. And sometimes, on the harsh frontier where dreams went to die, fighting was enough to change everything. The days that followed blurred into a relentless rhythm of labor that tested every limit Eleanor thought she had. She woke before dawn each morning, her body protesting the unfamiliar physical demands, and worked until darkness made it impossible to continue. The transformation of the orchard's neglected harvest into marketable goods became an all-consuming mission that left no room for doubt or hesitation. Martha Jensen proved to be worth far more than her 30% share. She worked with the efficiency of someone who'd spent a lifetime turning scarcity into survival, her hands moving with practiced precision as she supervised the cooking, testing, and jarring process. The barn had become a small factory, with fires burning constantly under the copper kettle, steam rising in clouds that smelled of apples and cinnamon, and rows of filled jars cooling on makeshift shelves. The key is consistency, Martha explained on the third day, as Eleanor stirred a massive pot of apple butter that had been cooking for 6 hours. Every jar has to meet the same standard, or your reputation means nothing. One bad batch and customers remember forever. Eleanor's arms ached from the constant stirring, but she kept the rhythm steady. Through the barn door, she could see Caleb working with Jacob to repair the chicken coop, trying to extract every possible dollar of value from the property. Emma was washing jars at a station they'd set up near the creek, her young hands red from cold water and lye soap. "How did you survive after your husband died?" Eleanor asked quietly, not wanting to pry but needing to understand how Martha had endured what she'd endured. Martha's expression tightened, but she answered, "By refusing to be a victim. Everyone expected me to collapse, to beg for charity or remarry desperately to the first man who'd have a widow with 3 mouths to feed. Instead, I worked. Took every job I could find, no matter how hard or how demeaning. Taught my children that pride is a luxury and survival is an art." She tested the apple butter with a wooden spoon, nodding satisfaction. "This is ready. Start filling jars." They worked in synchronized silence, Eleanor ladling the thick, dark butter into sterilized jars, while Martha sealed them with paraffin wax. Each jar represented money they desperately needed, but also something more, proof that they could create value from resources others had dismissed as worthless. By the 4th day, they'd produced 47 jars of apple butter, 32 jars of whole preserves, and 8 pounds of dried apple slices. Martha's critical eye had rejected anything less than perfect, composting fruit that didn't meet her standards rather than risk their reputation with inferior product. "It's good work," she said, surveying their production with evident satisfaction. "Better than good. This will sell." Eleanor calculated quickly. At the prices she'd negotiated, this represented roughly $85, more than she'd hoped, but still nowhere near enough. They needed every additional dollar they could generate, and time was accelerating toward the foreclosure deadline with terrifying speed. That evening, after Martha and her children had departed, Eleanor sat at the kitchen table making careful entries in a new ledger she'd started. Caleb watched her work, nursing a cup of coffee and trying to ignore the exhaustion that made his hand shake slightly. "We're at day 10, he said quietly. 11 days until foreclosure. Even with the Apple money, the cattle sale, and the seed drill, we'll have maybe $250. That's not even a third of what we owe. It's enough to demonstrate good faith and serious intent." Eleanor didn't look up from her calculations. Combined with Cole's legal challenge, it might be enough to force negotiation. Or it might not be. "Eleanor, I appreciate everything you're doing, everything we've accomplished together. But we need to face reality. Reality is that we're still fighting." Eleanor set down her pen and met his eyes. "Reality is that we've created value where there was none. We've found legal leverage, and we've exposed corruption. That's more than you had 2 weeks ago. It's still not enough to win. Maybe not, but it's enough to make them work for their victory." Eleanor stood and moved to the window, staring out at the dark land. "Caleb, I've been thinking about something. What if I went to the territorial capital, directly to the banking regulators, over Blackwood's head?" Caleb's cup clattered against the table. "That's a 3-day ride each way. We don't have 6 days to spare. Then I'll take the train, 2 days total if I move fast. You can handle the ranch alone for 48 hours. Eleanor turned to face him. "If I can convince the Territorial Banking Authority that Blackwood's conducting improper foreclosures, they might intervene. It's a long shot, but it's insane. Eleanor, you can't just walk into the Capitol and expect officials to care about one struggling ranch. Not one ranch, multiple ranches. I'd need documentation of other foreclosures Blackwood's conducted, proof of a pattern of corruption." Eleanor's mind was racing, seeing possibilities. If I could show systematic abuse, that becomes a regulatory issue, not just our private problem. Where would you get that documentation? From other victims, from public records at the county land office, from anyone willing to talk about how Blackwood destroyed them. Eleanor grabbed her shawl. "I'm going to ride to the nearest neighboring ranch tomorrow morning. The Hendersons, didn't you say they lost their property last year?" "Eleanor, it's past dark and you're exhausted. I'm going to plan the approach, not execute it tonight." But the energy in her voice was unmistakable. This was what she did best, not physical labor, but strategic thinking, finding angles others missed, connecting dots that seemed unrelated. "We've been playing defense, reacting to their moves. It's time to attack." Caleb stood and crossed to her, putting his hands on her shoulders. The gesture was both restraining and supportive, acknowledgement of her determination and concern for her well-being. "You've been working yourself to exhaustion for 10 days straight. You need rest." I'll rest when we've won, or lost, but not while the battle's still being fought." Eleanor met his eyes, and something passed between them. Understanding, respect, and something deeper that neither was quite ready to name. "Caleb, I didn't come all this way to lose because we were too tired or too cautious. If there's a chance, any chance, we take it." He studied her face in the lamplight. This remarkable woman who'd appeared in his life like an answer to a prayer he hadn't known how to pray. "All right, tomorrow you investigate other foreclosures. I'll focus on getting the cattle ready for market. The buyer arrives in 3 days. We'll press every advantage we have." They separated to their bedrooms, but Eleanor lay awake long into the night, her mind churning through strategies and contingencies. The plan forming in her head was audacious, maybe desperate, but it had the virtue of being unexpected. Blackwood and Garrett thought they were fighting a losing rancher and his mail-order bride. They had no idea they were facing someone who'd learned business warfare in Philadelphia's merchant houses, someone who understood that information and leverage could defeat superior resources. The next morning, Eleanor rode out early to visit the Henderson property, now owned by Samuel Garrett after the bank foreclosed 8 months earlier. The house stood empty, windows dark, a monument to crushed dreams. But a few miles south, she found the Hendersons themselves, living in a shabby homestead barely larger than a shed, the proud family reduced to tenant farming on land they'd once hoped to own. Thomas Henderson answered her knock, his face showing the deep lines of a man who'd aged a decade in a single year. His wife hovered behind him, wary and protective. "Mr. Henderson, my name is Eleanor Hayes. I'm working with Caleb Turner on his ranch. I understand you went through foreclosure with First Territorial Bank last year." Henderson's expression hardened. What of it? You here to gloat? Garrett sent you to make sure we're suffering properly? I'm here because Garrett's trying to do the same thing to us, and I'm looking for ammunition to fight back. Did Blackwood conduct your foreclosure properly, or were there irregularities? Henderson and his wife exchanged glances. Finally, Henderson stepped outside, pulling the door closed behind him. There were plenty of irregularities, fees that appeared out of nowhere, interest calculated wrong, deadlines that didn't match what the original loan said. I tried to fight it, even hired a lawyer for a while, but I ran out of money for legal fees before the case could be heard. Do you still have the documents? The loan agreement, the foreclosure notices, correspondence with the bank? Some of it. Wife saved what she could when they forced us out. Henderson's jaw worked with suppressed rage. Why? You think you can do what I couldn't? I think if I can prove a pattern of misconduct across multiple foreclosures, I can make this a regulatory issue that's bigger than any single case, but I need evidence. Eleanor pulled out her notebook. Would you be willing to let me review your documents and potentially testify if this goes to a hearing? Testify against Blackwood, against Garrett? Henderson laughed bitterly. Lady, I'd have to live in this territory after stirring up that kind of trouble. Those men destroy people who cross them. They're going to destroy you whether you fight back or not. At least this way, you'd be hitting back. Eleanor softened her voice. Mr. Henderson, I know you're scared. I know you've already lost everything once, but they're counting on that fear to keep you silent. If we all stay silent, they keep winning. Henderson stared at her for a long moment, wrestling with fear and anger. Finally, he nodded slowly. I'll get you the papers, but I'm not promising testimony. Let's see what you can do with documents first. Eleanor spent 2 hours reviewing the Henderson foreclosure documents, her anger growing with each page. The irregularities were blatant. Interest compounded improperly, acceleration notices sent without proper waiting periods, fees assessed that had no basis in the original loan agreement. It was almost as if Blackwood hadn't expected anyone to look closely, hadn't believed his victims would fight back. She copied the most damaging information into her notebook, thanked the Hendersons, and rode to 2 more properties that had faced foreclosure in the past 18 months. The pattern was identical. Blackwood using technicalities and improper procedures to accelerate foreclosures, then Garrett appearing to purchase the properties at auction for far below market value. By the time Eleanor returned to the Turner Ranch, the sun was setting, and she had documentation of 4 separate foreclosures, all showing the same pattern of misconduct. It was enough. It had to be enough. Caleb was in the barn when she arrived, and one look at her face told him she'd found something significant. What happened? Eleanor dismounted, her body aching from a full day in the saddle. I found proof that Blackwood's been running this scheme systematically. 4 foreclosures in 18 months, all with the same irregularities, all ending with Garrett buying the land cheap. This isn't isolated corruption, it's organized theft. Can you use it? I'm going to the territorial capital tomorrow. I'll take the morning train from Grand Island, be there by evening. I'll spend 1 day presenting evidence to banking regulators, then return the next day. 3 days total. We can afford 3 days. Eleanor handed him the reins of her horse. While I'm gone, you need to complete the cattle sale, deliver the preserved goods to market, and hold the ranch together. Can you do that? Caleb took the reins, his expression mixing admiration and concern. Eleanor, this is dangerous. If Blackwood finds out you're going over his head to territorial authorities, then we'd better make sure he doesn't find out until it's too late. Eleanor headed toward the house. I need to prepare documentation tonight. Cole's sending his letter to the bank tomorrow. That will keep Blackwood distracted while I make my move. Timing is everything. That night, Eleanor worked until midnight, organizing evidence, drafting a formal complaint to the Territorial Banking Commission, preparing her case like a lawyer going to trial. She outlined the systematic nature of the misconduct, the coordination between Blackwood and Garrett, the pattern of victims who'd been too poor or too frightened to fight back effectively. Caleb brought her coffee periodically, watching her work with something approaching awe. You could have been a lawyer yourself or a business owner. Women don't get those opportunities. We have to fight for every scrap of authority, and even then we're dismissed as aberrations. Eleanor didn't look up from her writing. But out here, on the frontier, the rules are different. Competence matters more than gender. At least, it matters enough to give us a fighting chance. You've changed everything, Eleanor. Not just the ranch situation, but me. The way I think about problems, about possibilities. Caleb set down the coffee cup. Whatever happens with the foreclosure, I want you to know that. You've reminded me that surrender isn't inevitable. Eleanor looked up, meeting his eyes. For a moment, the documents and deadlines faded, and there was just the two of them in the quiet house, partners who'd become something more without quite acknowledging it. We're going to win, Caleb. I don't know how yet, but we're going to win, because we have something Blackwood and Garrett don't. What's that? We have nothing to lose and everything to fight for. That makes us dangerous in ways they can't anticipate. She returned to her writing. Now let me finish this. I need to catch the early train. The next morning arrived too quickly. Eleanor dressed in her most professional outfit, the dark green traveling suit that had served her well at the bank, her hair pinned severely, her expression that of a woman on serious business. She packed light, just a small bag with essentials for 3 days, and the leather portfolio containing all her carefully organized evidence. Caleb drove her to Grand Island in the pre-dawn darkness, the wagon rattling along the frozen road. They spoke little, both focused on what lay ahead. At the train station, Caleb helped her down and carried her bag to the platform. The 5:15 to Lincoln leaves in 10 minutes, he said, checking his pocket watch. You'll arrive by mid-afternoon. Find a decent hotel. Nothing fancy, but nothing dangerous either. Present your case tomorrow morning, then catch the evening train back. I'll be fine, Caleb. I've traveled alone before. But Eleanor appreciated his concern, the way he wanted to protect her even while respecting her independence. I know you will. You're the strongest person I've ever met. He hesitated, then took her hand. Be careful. Blackwood has connections everywhere, including probably in the capital. If he learns what you're doing, he won't. Not until it's too late. Eleanor squeezed his hand, feeling the roughness of his calloused palm, the strength in his grip. Hold things together here. Sell the cattle, get the best price you can. I'll be back in 3 days with either salvation or we'll know we gave this fight everything we had. The train whistle sounded, a lonely wail in the cold morning. Eleanor pulled her hand free reluctantly and picked up her bag. 3 days, Caleb, then we finish this. She boarded without looking back, finding a seat by the window. As the train pulled away, she caught a glimpse of Caleb standing on the platform, watching her go, and felt a tightness in her chest that had nothing to do with the mission ahead and everything to do with what she was leaving behind. The journey to Lincoln took 6 hours, the train stopping at every small town and depot along the route. Eleanor used the time to review her documentation one final time, rehearsing her presentation, anticipating objections, and preparing responses. She was going up against a system that didn't want to be challenged, presenting evidence of corruption to officials who might themselves be corrupt or simply unwilling to act. But she'd learned long ago that the willingness to speak truth to power was itself a form of power. Sometimes, the only weapon available was the refusal to be silenced. Lincoln was larger than Grand Island, but still rough around the edges, a territorial capital trying to project authority while surrounded by prairie that reminded everyone how tenuous civilization's hold really was. Eleanor found a modest hotel near the Capitol building, checked in under her own name, no deception here, no hiding, and spent the evening preparing for the next day's confrontation. She slept poorly, her mind racing through scenarios and strategies. What if the banking commission refused to see her? What if they listened but took no action? What if Blackwood had enough influence to shut down any investigation before it started? But in the darkest hours of the night, Eleanor reminded herself of what she'd already accomplished. She'd turned a dying ranch into something with potential. She'd exposed corruption that had operated in shadows for years. She'd refused to accept defeat when defeat seemed certain. That had to count for something. Morning arrived with bitter cold and gray skies that threatened snow. Eleanor dressed carefully, ate a quick breakfast she could barely taste, and walked to the territorial capitol building with her portfolio under her arm and steel in her spine. The building was imposing, 3 stories of brick and limestone, designed to convey governmental authority. Inside, a maze of offices and corridors filled with clerks and officials conducting the business of territorial administration. Eleanor found the Banking Commission office on the 2nd floor, announced herself to a skeptical secretary, and settled in to wait. An hour passed, then 2. Other petitioners came and went, most looking frustrated or defeated. Eleanor waited with the patience she'd learned from her father. Sometimes, victory went to whoever could outlast everyone else's attention span. Finally, the secretary called her name. "Miss Hayes, Commissioner Aldridge will see you now." Eleanor entered an office that smelled of pipe tobacco and old paper. Commissioner Marcus Aldridge was perhaps 60, with white hair and tired eyes that suggested a man who'd seen too much corruption to be easily shocked. He gestured to a chair across from his cluttered desk. "Miss Hayes, my secretary says you have evidence of banking misconduct in Custer County. That's a serious accusation." "It's a serious situation, Commissioner." Eleanor opened her portfolio, spreading documents across his desk with practiced precision. "I'm here to present evidence of systematic foreclosure fraud being conducted by First Territorial Bank of Grand Island, specifically by Bank President Cyrus Blackwood, in coordination with local rancher Samuel Garrett." Aldridge's eyebrows rose slightly. He began examining the documents. Eleanor guided him through the evidence methodically. The Henderson foreclosure with its improper interest calculations, the Turner loan with its questionable acceleration, the two other cases showing identical patterns of misconduct. She'd organized everything clearly, making the pattern impossible to miss. "These irregularities are consistent across multiple foreclosures," Eleanor explained. "The victims are systematically overcharged, given inadequate notice, and forced into auctions where Garrett purchases the properties for far below market value. This isn't legitimate banking. It's organized theft using the banking system as cover." Aldridge studied the documents in silence, his expression unreadable. Finally, he looked up. "Miss Hayes, you've done impressive investigative work here, but you must understand that initiating a formal investigation into a bank is extremely complex. There are political considerations, economic impacts. There are also victims who've lost everything to illegal foreclosures. Doesn't that matter more than political considerations?" "Of course it matters, but, Commissioner Aldridge, I'm not asking you to shut down the bank or arrest anyone. I'm asking for a formal review of these foreclosures and a temporary stay on the Turner property foreclosure while that review is conducted. That's a reasonable request given the evidence of systematic misconduct." Aldridge leaned back in his chair, studying her. "What's your interest in this, Miss Hayes? You're not the property owner. What's your stake?" Eleanor met his eyes steadily. "I'm Caleb Turner's business partner and future wife. That ranch represents our future together. But more than that, I believe in the rule of law. I believe that banks shouldn't be allowed to steal property through fraudulent procedures. If that makes me naive, so be it." Something shifted in Aldridge's expression. Respect, maybe, or recognition of genuine conviction. "You understand that even if I order a review, it will take weeks, possibly months to complete, and that the outcome isn't guaranteed." "I understand, but a stay on the foreclosure while the review is conducted, that gives us time to restructure the debt legitimately. That's all we're asking for. Time and fair treatment." Aldridge gathered the documents, tapping them into a neat stack. "I'll review this material more thoroughly and consult with my colleagues on the commission. If the evidence supports what you're claiming, I'll order a preliminary investigation and potentially issue a temporary stay on foreclosures by First Territorial Bank, pending that investigation." "How long will that take?" "Give me 3 days. I'll send notification to both you and the bank by week's end." He stood, offering his hand. "Miss Hayes, I admire your courage in bringing this forward. Not many people are willing to challenge powerful interests, especially newcomers to the territory." Eleanor shook his hand firmly. "Powerful interests only remain powerful when people are too frightened to challenge them." "Thank you for your time, Commissioner." She left the building with cautious hope beating in her chest. Aldridge hadn't made promises, but he'd taken her seriously. He'd seen the evidence and acknowledged its significance. That was more than she'd dared expect. But 3 days for his decision meant the foreclosure deadline would pass before any official action. They'd still need to execute their original plan. Present partial payment, threaten legal action, use every piece of leverage available. The Banking Commission investigation was a potential backstop, not a solution in itself. Eleanor spent the rest of the day making copies of her evidence at a document service near the Capitol, ensuring she had backup records. Then she treated herself to a decent dinner at a restaurant near her hotel, the first meal in weeks that wasn't eaten standing up or too exhausted to taste properly. As she ate, she reflected on how much had changed in 2 weeks. She'd arrived in Nebraska expecting to be a mail-order bride, perhaps managing a household and supporting her husband's ranching work. Instead, she'd become a business strategist, an investigator of corruption, a fighter against forces that crushed people without remorse. The Eleanor Hayes who'd left Philadelphia would barely recognize the woman she'd become. And the strange thing was, she liked this version better. Out here, stripped of social niceties and limited to brutal necessities, she'd discovered capabilities she'd never had opportunity to develop back east. That evening, lying in the hotel bed and listening to unfamiliar city noises through the window, Eleanor allowed herself to think about Caleb, not as a business partner or the owner of a struggling ranch, but as a man. A good man who'd been honest even when honesty cost him everything, who'd welcomed her partnership rather than resenting her interference, who looked at her with respect and something deeper that made her pulse quicken. She'd come to Nebraska for security and partnership. She'd found both, but also something she hadn't expected, the possibility of genuine connection, of love built on mutual respect and shared struggle rather than romantic fantasy. If they won this fight, if they saved the ranch, what then? A real marriage, a real partnership in every sense? The thought both excited and frightened her. She'd been independent for so long, shaped by loss and disappointment into someone who expected nothing and protected herself accordingly. But Caleb made her want to risk hope again, made her believe that partnership could mean more than survival. It could mean building something genuine and lasting. Eleanor fell asleep thinking about possibilities beyond mere survival, and dreamed of spring on the prairie, of land that could be healed and made productive, of a future they could create together if only they could survive the present. The return journey the next day felt longer than the outbound trip, every mile stretching as Eleanor's anxiety about the ranch grew. She'd been gone 2 days. Had Caleb managed the cattle sale? Had anything gone wrong? Had Garrett or Blackwood made any aggressive moves? The train finally pulled into Grand Island in late afternoon, and Eleanor practically ran to where Caleb waited with the wagon. His expression told her immediately that something had happened. "What's wrong?" Caleb helped her into the wagon, his jaw tight. Garrett made his move. "Yesterday, while you were gone, he filed a formal complaint with the county land office claiming that our eastern boundary fence encroaches on public land, blocking access to the creek. He's demanding the fence be moved 30 feet west, which would give him access to the creek without buying your property." Eleanor felt cold rage wash through her. He's trying to get through legal maneuvering what he couldn't get through foreclosure. The land office is sending a surveyor next week. If they rule in his favor, we lose the water rights even if we beat the foreclosure. Caleb's hands tightened on the reins. He's attacking from every angle, Eleanor. Every single angle. Eleanor's mind raced through implications and strategies. This was clever. Garrett had found another vulnerability and was exploiting it ruthlessly. Even if they saved the ranch from foreclosure, losing water rights would cripple their ability to make it profitable. What about the cattle sale? Completed. Got $22 per head for 5 animals. Total of $110. Caleb pulled a leather pouch from his pocket and handed it to her. Combined with the Apple money, Martha delivered the first batch to the general store this morning, got paid $83. We're at about $193 cash. Eleanor calculated quickly. The seed drill should fetch another $20. That gave them roughly $215, still woefully short of the $400 Blackwood said he'd need for restructuring. "We're going to that bank tomorrow," Eleanor said decisively. "We're presenting everything we have, the cash, the legal challenge from Cole, the evidence of the boundary dispute being coordinated harassment, and the information about the Banking Commission investigation. We're going to force negotiation through sheer overwhelming pressure. Eleanor, it's not enough. Maybe not, but it's time to find out." She turned to look at him, seeing the exhaustion and fear in his face, but also the determination that had sustained him through years of struggle. "Caleb, we've done everything possible. We've created value, exposed corruption, fought every battle available to us. Tomorrow, we see if it's enough. And if it's not, then at least we know we gave this everything we had." They rode back to the ranch in silence, both understanding that the endgame was approaching. All the preparation, all the struggle, all the desperate maneuvering, it was all leading to one final confrontation that would determine everything. The ranch looked the same as when Eleanor had left, the sagging buildings, the thin cattle, the struggling land. But she saw it differently now. She saw possibility instead of failure, potential instead of ruin. This land could be saved. This dream could survive. It just needed one more miracle. That night, they sat at the kitchen table counting their money, reviewing their evidence, preparing their final stand. $215 in cash, documentation of systematic bank corruption, a lawyer's challenge to the foreclosure, evidence of Garrett's coordinated harassment, and a pending banking commission investigation. It still wasn't enough, but it was everything they had. Tomorrow morning, first thing, we go to the bank, Eleanor said. We present our case. We force Blackwood to negotiate or risk everything we've uncovered becoming public knowledge. We bet everything on one roll of the dice. Caleb looked at the money spread across the table, the physical representation of weeks of exhausting labor, of Martha Jensen's expertise and her children's work, of Eleanor's strategic brilliance and his own stubborn refusal to quit. And if he calls our bluff? Then we lose. But Eleanor Hayes doesn't bluff. Every threat we make, we'll follow through on. Blackwood needs to believe that. She met his eyes across the table. Are you ready for this? I've been ready since the day you arrived and refused to run. Caleb reached across the table and took her hand. Whatever happens tomorrow, Eleanor, thank you. For seeing possibilities I couldn't see. For fighting battles I didn't know how to fight. For being the partner I needed even when I didn't know I needed one. Eleanor squeezed his hand, feeling the connection between them, forged in crisis, tested by adversity, stronger than anything that had come easy. We're going to win tomorrow, Caleb, because losing isn't acceptable. Because this land is worth fighting for. Because we're worth fighting for. They sat there in the quiet house, hands clasped across the scarred table. Two people who'd been strangers 3 weeks ago, now bound together in common cause and growing affection. Outside, the prairie wind sang its eternal song, indifferent to human struggles and dreams. But inside, hope burned bright and fierce, refusing to be extinguished by impossible odds or powerful enemies. Tomorrow would bring the final confrontation, the moment when everything they'd fought for would either be validated or destroyed. Eleanor released Caleb's hand and stood, moving toward the stairs. Get some rest. Tomorrow we need to be sharp. Tomorrow we end this one way or another. She climbed to her room and lay in the darkness, her mind refusing to quiet despite her exhaustion. She thought about Commissioner Aldridge reviewing evidence in Lincoln, about Martha Jensen's children learning that hard work could create opportunity, about Thomas Henderson living in a shed because corrupt men had stolen his dreams. She thought about Caleb sleeping across the hall and the life they could build together if only they could survive tomorrow. And she thought about herself. Eleanor Hayes, the spinster piano teacher who'd been dismissed as past her prime, who'd taken a desperate gamble on a stranger's advertisement and found herself fighting a war against entrenched corruption. Whatever happened tomorrow, she'd proven something to herself. She was capable of more than anyone, including herself, had imagined. She was strong enough to fight impossible battles, smart enough to find leverage in unexpected places, brave enough to challenge powerful men who thought themselves untouchable. Win or lose, she'd changed. The frontier had stripped away the polite, constrained person she'd been forced to become in Philadelphia and revealed someone fiercer underneath, someone who could survive out here, someone who belonged. Eleanor finally drifted into uneasy sleep as midnight approached and dreamed of standing before Cyrus Blackwood with evidence and determination, refusing to be intimidated, forcing him to see her as the formidable opponent she'd become. Tomorrow would tell if determination and intelligence could defeat money and corruption. Tomorrow would reveal whether the impossible fight they'd been waging had any chance of success. Tomorrow would change everything, one way or another. And Eleanor Hayes would face it with her head high and her resolve unshaken, because she'd come too far and fought too hard to surrender now, no matter what tomorrow might bring. Dawn broke over the Turner Ranch with crystalline clarity, the kind of cold morning where every sound carried sharp and distinct across the frozen prairie. Eleanor stood at her bedroom window watching the sun rise, knowing this day would determine everything they'd fought for. She dressed with deliberate care, choosing her dark green suit one final time, arranging her hair with precision that bordered on ritual. Armor for battle, she thought, and allowed herself a grim smile at the metaphor. Downstairs, Caleb was already up, coffee brewing, his own attempt at presentable clothing, a clean shirt she hadn't seen before, trousers without visible patches, his hair combed back with water. They looked at each other across the kitchen and something passed between them, acknowledgement of what today meant, solidarity in facing it together. "Ready?" he asked, his voice rough with tension. "As ready as we'll ever be." Eleanor accepted the coffee he poured, wrapping her hands around the warm cup. We walk in there projecting absolute confidence. Blackwood needs to believe we hold stronger cards than we do. We're bluffing with a pair of threes. No, we're playing the only hand available and betting everything on it. That's not a bluff. That's commitment. Eleanor set down her cup. "Caleb, whatever happens in that office, remember this. We exposed corruption that operated in shadows for years. We created value where everyone saw only failure. We fought when surrender would have been easier. That matters, regardless of outcome." He moved closer, and for a moment Eleanor thought he might embrace her, but instead he just stood near, his presence solid and reassuring. "If we lose today, what will you do? Will you stay?" The question hung heavy between them. Eleanor considered her answer carefully, knowing it mattered more than any negotiation with Blackwood. "I made a commitment to partnership. Win or lose, I honor commitments. If we lose the ranch, we'll figure out what comes next together. Unless you want me to leave." "I don't want you to leave, ever." The words came out quiet but absolute. "Eleanor, I know this started as a business arrangement, but it's become more. It's become more." Eleanor met his eyes. "Let's save that conversation for after today. Right now we need to focus on the battle ahead." They loaded the wagon with their documentation, the cash counted and recounted, Cole's legal challenge in a sealed envelope, Eleanor's evidence of systematic foreclosure fraud, documentation of the boundary dispute harassment, and a letter Eleanor had drafted summarizing the Banking Commission investigation. Every weapon they possessed, carefully organized and ready for deployment. The ride to Grand Island passed in tense silence, both of them mentally rehearsing the confrontation ahead. The town was just beginning to stir when they arrived. Shopkeepers sweeping stoops, early risers moving with purpose through the cold morning. Eleanor and Caleb tied up outside First Territorial Bank just as Cyrus Blackwood's private carriage pulled up from the opposite direction. Blackwood emerged looking prosperous and confident, clearly not expecting trouble this morning. His expression shifted when he saw them waiting by his door. Surprise, then irritation, then calculation. "Mr. Turner, Miss Hayes, the bank doesn't open for another 20 minutes. "This isn't a banking transaction," Eleanor said calmly. "This is a negotiation regarding the foreclosure on the Turner property. We need to speak privately." Blackwood's eyes narrowed. "If you're here to beg for more time, we're here to present a settlement offer backed by significant leverage. You'll want to hear this in private, Mr. Blackwood. Trust me on that." Eleanor's tone left no room for dismissal. Blackwood studied them both, clearly reassessing. Finally, he unlocked the bank door. "Very well. My office. 5 minutes." They followed him through the empty bank, their footsteps echoing in the high-ceilinged space. Blackwood's office was exactly as Eleanor remembered. Expensive furniture, portraits of important men, everything designed to intimidate. But she'd been here before, and intimidation only worked on people who weren't already committed to fighting. Blackwood settled behind his desk, fingers steepled, expression showing controlled patience. "You have 5 minutes to explain why I shouldn't proceed with foreclosure in 8 days as planned." Eleanor placed her leather portfolio on his desk and opened it with deliberate precision. "Because proceeding with foreclosure will cost you far more than restructuring the debt. Let me show you why." She laid out the cash first, $215 in bills and coins, more money than many frontier families saw in a year. First, immediate payment of $215 against the outstanding balance. This demonstrates serious intent and good faith. Blackwood barely glanced at it. "That's not even a third of what's owed. It's insufficient." "It's a starting point." Eleanor produced Cole's legal challenge. Second, a formal legal challenge to the foreclosure based on multiple irregularities in your procedures. Interest calculations that don't match territorial standards, acceleration notices that violate required waiting periods, improper fee assessments. Attorney Matthias Cole is prepared to file this with the territorial court, which will delay foreclosure for months while the court reviews your practices. Blackwood's expression tightened slightly. Frivolous legal challenges won't save a failing ranch. Perhaps not. but they will attract scrutiny to your business practices. Eleanor produced her evidence of systematic foreclosure fraud. Third, documentation of a pattern of similar irregularities across 4 separate foreclosures you've conducted in the past 18 months, all showing the same questionable practices. All ending with Samuel Garrett purchasing the properties for below-market prices. That pattern suggests coordination. Now Blackwood's face went cold. You're making serious accusations, Miss Hayes. I'm presenting facts I've already shared with the Territorial Banking Commission. Eleanor placed Commissioner Aldridge's acknowledgement letter on top of the pile. Fourth, confirmation that the Banking Commission has opened a preliminary investigation into First Territorial Bank's foreclosure practices. Commissioner Aldridge expects to issue his findings within 2 weeks. If those findings show systematic misconduct, your bank's operating license could be suspended or revoked. Blackwood picked up the letter, read it quickly, and Eleanor saw the first crack in his composed facade. The Banking Commission investigation was real, documented, and beyond his immediate control. This wasn't an empty threat. This was a genuine regulatory problem. Finally, Eleanor continued, documentation that Samuel Garrett filed a fraudulent boundary dispute claim timed to coincide with the foreclosure. This demonstrates coordinated harassment and suggests collusion between your bank and Garrett to acquire the Turner property through multiple pressure tactics. That coordination itself may violate territorial banking regulations. She sat back, letting the weight of accumulated evidence sink in. Caleb had remained silent throughout, understanding that Eleanor was conducting this negotiation, but his presence added solidity to their united front. Blackwood studied the documents, his mind clearly racing through implications and calculations. When he finally spoke, his voice had lost its earlier confidence. What exactly are you proposing, Miss Hayes? Debt restructuring. You accept the $215 as immediate payment and restructure the remaining balance over 36 months at standard territorial interest rates. No compounding, no excessive fees, no acceleration clauses. In exchange, we withdraw the legal challenge and agree not to make the Banking Commission evidence public. That's not acceptable. The bank needs assurance that future payments will be made. Then take a lien on specific ranch assets, cattle, equipment, water rights if necessary. But you restructure the debt on fair terms that give us a genuine chance to succeed. Eleanor leaned forward. Mr. Blackwood, you're facing a choice. You can proceed with foreclosure and risk the Banking Commission investigation becoming public knowledge, along with all the documented evidence of your questionable practices. Or you can restructure this one debt, take a partial payment now, and make the whole problem disappear quietly. Garrett won't be pleased if I restructure. He wants that property. Then Garrett's disappointment is his problem, not yours, unless you're admitting your decisions are controlled by him, which would itself be evidence of improper banking practices. Eleanor's voice was steady as steel. You're the bank president, Mr. Blackwood. Act like it. Make the business decision that protects your bank, not the decision that serves Garrett's land acquisition strategy. Blackwood stood and walked to his window, staring out at the street. Eleanor and Caleb waited in silence, knowing this moment was the pivot point. Everything balanced on whether Blackwood's self-interest outweighed his loyalty to Garrett. Finally, Blackwood turned back. 36 months is too long. 24 months with quarterly payments of $100, starting 90 days from now. Interest at 8% simple interest, no compounding. Lien on all ranch assets as security. Miss one payment and the entire balance becomes due immediately. Eleanor calculated quickly. 24 months of quarterly payments meant 8 payments of $100. $800 total, which, with the $215 already paid, would bring the total to just over $1,000 once interest was factored. It was steep, brutally steep, but it was survivable if the ranch could generate steady income. 24 months, quarterly payments of $85, starting 90 days from now. Interest at 7%, same lien terms. Eleanor's counteroffer was immediate and firm. That's our final position. Blackwood's jaw worked as he considered. The difference between their positions was less than $100 over the life of the loan, a rounding error for the bank, but potentially crucial for the ranch. He was measuring whether pushing for better terms was worth the risk of losing the deal entirely. Done, he said finally. I'll have the restructuring papers drawn up by tomorrow. You'll sign, you'll leave the $215 as immediate payment, and the legal challenge gets withdrawn. Agreed, with one additional term. Eleanor pulled out a final document. You'll also sign a statement that the foreclosure acceleration was based on procedural error and is being corrected through good faith negotiation. That statement goes to the banking commission as evidence that you're correcting past irregularities. That's admitting fault. That's admitting to correctable procedural errors while demonstrating good faith effort to remedy them. The banking commission is more likely to close their investigation if they see you taking corrective action. Eleanor pushed the document across the desk. It protects both of us, Mr. Blackwood. You look cooperative rather than corrupt, and we get documentation that helps ensure you honor the restructuring terms. Blackwood read the statement, made a few minor edits in the wording, and signed it. Eleanor witnessed his signature, then filed the document in her portfolio with satisfaction. They'd done it. Against impossible odds, they'd forced negotiation and won restructuring terms that gave the ranch a fighting chance. But as they stood to leave, Blackwood's voice stopped them at the door. Miss Hayes, a word of warning. Samuel Garrett is not a man who accepts defeat gracefully. He wanted that property, and you've just taken it off the table. He'll find other ways to make your life difficult. Let him try. We've beaten worse odds than Samuel Garrett. Eleanor met his eyes without flinching. And Mr. Blackwood? If I discover you're helping him in any way, if there are any unexplained problems with our restructured loan, any mysterious complications, I'll make sure every newspaper in the territory knows about the systematic foreclosure fraud documented in that banking commission file. Are we clear? Blackwood's expression went cold. Perfectly clear, Miss Hayes. I suspect we'll maintain a purely professional relationship going forward. That's all I ask. Eleanor nodded curtly and followed Caleb out of the office, through the empty bank, and into the cold morning air that felt suddenly easier to breathe. They didn't speak until they'd climbed into the wagon and driven 2 blocks away. Then Caleb pulled to a stop, turned to Eleanor, and without warning pulled her into an embrace that nearly knocked the breath from her lungs. We did it, he said against her hair. Eleanor, we actually did it. She let herself lean into him for just a moment, allowing the tension of the past weeks to drain away in the warmth of his arms. We did. 24 months to turn that ranch into something profitable enough to make quarterly payments. That's the next battle. Caleb pulled back, his hands on her shoulders, his eyes intense. We'll win that battle too, together. Like we've won every other impossible fight you've led us through. He kissed her forehead, quick and natural, then seemed to realize what he'd done and pulled back with embarrassment. I'm sorry, I shouldn't. Don't apologize. Eleanor's heart was racing, but not from fear. Caleb, when this started, I thought I was entering a business arrangement. Somewhere along the way, it became something more. I think we both know that. I know I came to Nebraska looking for a wife, found a warrior instead, and fell in love with both. The words came out rough but sincere. I don't know the proper timing for these things. Don't know if I'm supposed to wait or court you properly or... Eleanor kissed him, cutting off his uncertain rambling with decisive action. It was brief, chaste by any measure, but it sealed something between them that words couldn't quite capture. Partnership becoming something deeper. Respect becoming affection, becoming love, born of shared struggle. When they separated, both slightly breathless, Eleanor managed a shaky smile. I think we can dispense with traditional courtship given the circumstances. We've already weathered worse than most married couples face in a lifetime. Is that a yes to making this partnership permanent? Because Eleanor Hayes, I'm asking you to actually marry me, not just as a business arrangement, but as a real marriage. I'm asking you to build a life with me on that struggling ranch, knowing it's going to be years of hard work with no guarantee of success. Yes. The answer is yes to all of it. The marriage, the partnership, the years of hard work, all of it. Eleanor took his hand. But first, we need to deal with Samuel Garrett and his boundary dispute claim. We haven't won yet, Caleb. We've just bought ourselves time to win. The mention of Garrett sobered them both. The immediate crisis was resolved, but Blackwood's warning echoed in Eleanor's mind. Garrett had built an empire by crushing competition, and he wouldn't accept this defeat without retaliation. They drove back toward the ranch, planning their next moves. The boundary dispute needed to be addressed before the surveyor arrived. The ranch operations needed to be optimized to generate enough income for those quarterly payments. and they needed to anticipate whatever revenge Garrett might be planning. As they crested the hill overlooking the Turner property, Eleanor saw something that made her grab Caleb's arm. "Stop the wagon." In the valley below, smoke rose from multiple points on the ranch. Not the chimney smoke of normal activity, thick, black smoke that spoke of something burning. And near the western fence line, she could see figures on horseback, too far away to identify clearly, but moving with purpose that looked hostile. "Garrett!" Caleb said, his voice tight with rage. "That son of a—" He whipped the horses into a run, the wagon bouncing dangerously over the rough ground as they raced toward the ranch. As they drew closer, the situation became clearer and more devastating. The barn where they'd processed the apple harvest was burning, flames eating through the old dry wood with terrifying speed. The chicken coop was already reduced to smoking ruins. And riding away toward Garrett's property were 4 men on horseback, one of them turning back to watch their handiwork with evident satisfaction. Eleanor recognized the build and posture of the rider, even at this distance. Samuel Garrett, making sure they understood this was personal retaliation. Caleb leaped from the wagon before it fully stopped, running toward the barn. Eleanor followed, already knowing it was too late to save the structure, but desperately hoping the fire hadn't spread to the stored inventory. They'd left jars of preserves in there, dried fruit, all the product they'd worked so hard to create. The heat drove them back before they could get close. Through the barn door, Eleanor could see flames consuming everything: the old copper kettle they'd used for processing, the wooden shelves holding finished product, even the empty jars they'd cleaned for future use. Weeks of work, $85 worth of sold product waiting for delivery, Martha Jensen's hopes for steady income, all of it burning. "The house!" Caleb gasped, already running toward it. If they set the barn, they might have set the house too. They burst through the front door to find everything intact but for a paper nailed to the table with a knife. Eleanor grabbed it, reading the message scrawled in crude handwriting. Foreclosure might be stopped, but accidents happen regular on failing ranches. Sell while you still can. A friend. Caleb read over her shoulder, his hands clenched into fists. "I'm going after them. I'm going to Garrett's ranch, and You're going to do nothing that gives him an excuse to have you arrested or killed." Eleanor grabbed his arm. "That's exactly what he wants. Provocation that lets him claim self-defense or file charges against you. We don't react emotionally. We respond strategically." "They burned our barn, Eleanor. They destroyed weeks of work." "I know. And we're going to make them pay for it, but not through violence. Through law, through exposure, through the same weapons we've been using all along." Eleanor forced herself to think past the rage and devastation. "We go to the county sheriff. We file a formal complaint. We report this arson. We name Garrett as the prime suspect based on his threats and his motivation. We make this official and documented. The sheriff won't do anything. Garrett probably owns him too. Maybe. But we create a record. We force the sheriff to either investigate or refuse to investigate. Either outcome we can use." Eleanor moved toward the door. "Right now, we need to make sure the fire doesn't spread to anything else. Then we salvage what we can. Then we fight back, but smart, not angry." They spent the next hour containing the fire, using buckets from the creek to wet down the surrounding buildings and ground. The barn was a total loss, collapsed into itself in a smoking ruin. The chicken coop was gone, but the house, the other outbuildings, and most importantly the cattle, were untouched. As the immediate crisis stabilized, Martha Jensen arrived in her wagon, her children with her, all of them staring in horror at the destruction. "We saw the smoke from our place." "What happened?" Eleanor explained quickly, watching Martha's face cycle through shock, grief, and finally cold anger. All their work, all those hours of labor, the product they'd been so proud of, destroyed by Garrett's vindictive cruelty. "That man should be horsewhipped," Martha said flatly. "He's destroyed my future income, same as yours. Can we prove it was him?" "Not definitively, but we can create enough circumstantial evidence to make his life difficult." Eleanor turned to Caleb. "We need to go to the sheriff now, before Garrett can establish an alibi or cover story. The longer we wait, the easier it is for him to deny involvement." The ride back to Grand Island, so triumphant just hours ago, now felt heavy with defeat snatched from victory. They found Sheriff Tom Bradley at his office, a heavy-set man in his 50s with the weary expression of someone who'd seen too much of human nature's worst qualities. Eleanor laid out the situation clearly. The timing of the arson immediately after their successful negotiation with the bank, the figures seen riding away toward Garrett's property, the threatening note, Garrett's established pattern of harassment through the boundary dispute. She presented it as a case requiring investigation, not making accusations but connecting obvious dots. Bradley listened with the patience of a man who already knew how this would end. "Miss Hayes, I understand your suspicions, but you didn't actually see who set those fires. The note isn't signed, and Mr. Garrett is a respected rancher with no history of criminal activity." No recorded history? Because victims like us don't have the resources to pursue charges, and local law enforcement won't investigate without definitive proof. Eleanor kept her voice level despite her anger. "Sheriff, I'm not asking you to arrest anyone. I'm asking you to investigate. Talk to Garrett. Ask him where he was this morning. See if his hands smell like kerosene. Do the job you're sworn to do." Bradley's expression hardened. "I know my job, Miss Hayes. I'll look into the matter, but I won't pursue charges based on speculation and spite." It's not spite when someone burns down your barn and destroys your livelihood. It's recognizing a pattern of coordinated harassment by a powerful man who thinks he's above the law. Eleanor placed her documentation of the boundary dispute on his desk. This is all connected. The foreclosure attempt, the boundary claim, now arson. Garrett wants the Turner property, and he's willing to use any means necessary to force us out. You got quite an imagination, Miss Hayes. Folks could say you're the one causing trouble, coming in from back east and stirring things up that were settled before you arrived. The implication was clear. Bradley wasn't going to help because he either feared Garrett or was already in his pocket. Eleanor had suspected as much, but confirming it was still disappointing. The sheriff was supposed to enforce law impartially, but out here on the frontier, power determined justice more often than right and wrong. Fine. I'll note your refusal to investigate in my report to the territorial authorities. Eleanor gathered her papers. When the Banking Commission follows up on the systematic corruption in this county, your lack of action will be part of the pattern they review. Enjoy explaining to territorial officials why you refuse to investigate obvious arson. They left before Bradley could respond, both understanding they'd get no help from local law enforcement. Outside, Caleb leaned against the wagon, defeat written in every line of his body. "They're going to keep coming at us, Eleanor. Every time we win, they'll hit us somewhere else. Eventually, they'll wear us down or force us into a mistake that gives them an excuse to finish us. Maybe. But we're not giving up because winning is hard." Eleanor climbed into the wagon. "We've lost a barn and inventory, but we haven't lost the land or the ranch itself. We still have the restructured debt. We still have assets we can build on. We rebuild. That's what you do on the frontier. You rebuild from whatever disasters strike." "With what money? We just gave Blackwood everything we had. We can't afford to rebuild a barn." "Then we operate without a barn for now. We focus on what we can do with what we have. The cattle don't need a barn. They need pasture and water, both of which we still control. We can't process more apples this year, but spring will bring new opportunities." Eleanor took his hand. "Caleb, I know this feels like defeat, but Garrett's desperate move tells me something important. He's afraid of us. If he thought we'd just fade away, he wouldn't have bothered with arson. He attacked because we're a genuine threat to his plans." "Some threat. We can't even protect our own property." "We weren't there to protect it because we were winning a battle at the bank. We can't be everywhere at once, can't defend against every possible attack. But we can make sure each attack costs Garrett more than it costs us." Eleanor's mind was already working through implications and strategies. "That arson just gave us ammunition. We document the damage, we photograph the ruins, we add it to our evidence file. When the Banking Commission investigates the pattern of harassment, this becomes another data point. Garrett thinks he's won this round, but he's actually just created more evidence against himself." They drove back to the ranch in afternoon light that seemed harsh and unforgiving. The smoking ruins of the barn looked even worse in full daylight, a monument to their vulnerability. Martha and her children had left, promises to help rebuild ringing hollow against the scale of destruction. That evening, Eleanor and Caleb sat on the porch of the house that had somehow become home, watching the sunset paint the prairie in shades of gold and crimson. The day that had started with triumph had ended in disaster, victory, and defeat, so intertwined that it was hard to separate them. "We're getting married tomorrow," Caleb said suddenly. I'm not waiting anymore, not giving Garrett or anyone else time to interfere. Tomorrow morning, we ride to the county clerk, we file the papers, and we make this legal and permanent." Eleanor looked at him in surprise. "That's your proposal? After everything that happened today?" "That's exactly why I'm proposing it today. Eleanor, I've watched you fight impossible battles for 3 weeks. I've seen you turn defeat into possibility again and again. I've fallen in love with your mind, your courage, your absolute refusal to surrender. I don't want to wait for the perfect moment because there's never going to be a perfect moment out here. There's just now, and the commitment to face whatever comes next together." Eleanor felt tears prickling her eyes, exhaustion and emotion finally overwhelming her careful control. "All right, tomorrow. We'll make it legal and permanent, and then we'll figure out how to survive the next crisis together." "Is that romantic enough for you?" Caleb managed a tired smile. "It's perfect for us. Practical, honest, and built on partnership rather than fantasy." Eleanor leaned against him, letting herself draw strength from his solid presence. "Caleb, I need to tell you something. When I came here, I thought I was settling for security because I was too old and too poor for anything better. But what I found was something far more valuable, a partner who sees me as equal, who respects my mind as much as any domestic skills, who lets me be strong instead of requiring me to be helpless. That's rarer than romantic love, and maybe more important. Then let's build our marriage on that: partnership, respect, and the knowledge that we're stronger together than we could ever be apart." Caleb took her hand. "Tomorrow morning, we become husband and wife legally. Then we start planning how to survive the next 24 months of quarterly payments while dealing with whatever Garrett throws at us next." They sat on the porch until full darkness fell. Two people who'd found each other through desperation and circumstance, now choosing each other deliberately despite knowing how hard the fight ahead would be. Around them, the prairie night settled in with its familiar sounds: wind through grass, distant cattle, the creaking of old wood adjusting to temperature changes. The burned barn was a dark silhouette against the starlit sky, testament to the price of resistance. But the house still stood, the land still stretched fertile and full of potential, and two people sat together making plans that refused to accept defeat as inevitable. Eleanor thought about the journey that had brought her here. From Philadelphia piano teacher to Nebraska rancher's wife. From dependent spinster to equal partner in an impossible fight. She'd discovered capabilities she hadn't known she possessed, strength she hadn't realized she had. The frontier had tested her in ways Philadelphia never could, and she'd met every test. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. Tomorrow they'd formalize their partnership before officials and law. Tomorrow they'd begin the long struggle to make quarterly payments while defending against a powerful enemy who wanted them destroyed. But tonight, they had each other. Tonight, they had a plan. Tonight, they were alive and fighting and refusing to surrender. And sometimes, on the harsh Nebraska prairie where survival itself was victory, that was enough to call a triumph. Morning arrived with the peculiar silence that follows disaster, the kind of quiet that feels like the world holding its breath. Eleanor woke before dawn, as had become her habit, but this morning carried different weight. Today she would become Eleanor Turner, legally and permanently bound to this land and this man and this impossible fight they'd chosen together. She dressed carefully in her best remaining outfit, the dark blue wool dress she'd worn on her arrival to Nebraska, and pinned her hair with particular attention. Marriage deserved ceremony even when circumstances were dire, deserved acknowledgement that something significant was happening despite the smoking ruins visible from her window. Caleb was waiting downstairs, also dressed in his best, the same clothes he'd worn to the bank, cleaned and pressed with evident care. He looked up as she descended, and something in his expression made Eleanor's breath catch. This was real. This mattered. "You look beautiful," he said simply. "Ready to make this legal?" "Ready?" Eleanor took his offered arm. "Though I suspect the county clerk will wonder why we're in such a hurry." "Let them wonder. We know why." Caleb helped her into the wagon, and they set out for Grand Island under skies that threatened snow, winter announcing its full arrival. The county clerk's office was in a modest building near the courthouse, staffed by an efficient woman in her 40s who barely looked up when they entered. "Help you folks? We'd like to file marriage papers," Caleb said. "Eleanor Hayes and Caleb Turner." Now the clerk looked up, interest sharpening her expression. Eleanor recognized the look, curiosity about the mail-order bride who'd been causing so much commotion, speculation about this unlikely partnership. But the woman kept her thoughts private and simply pulled out the necessary forms. You'll both need to sign here, here, and here. Filing fee is $2. I can process this immediately, and you'll be legally married under territorial law. $2 they could barely afford, but Eleanor paid it without hesitation. They signed the documents in turn, their signatures looking oddly formal on official paper, making permanent what had begun as desperate convenience. The clerk witnessed their marks, stamped the papers with official seal, and handed them a certificate. Congratulations, Mr. and Mrs. Turner. May you have a long and prosperous marriage. Thank you, Eleanor said, accepting the certificate that transformed her from Eleanor Hayes to Eleanor Turner, from independent woman to married partner. The change felt both monumental and strangely anticlimactic. After everything they'd already been through, the legal formality seemed almost beside the point. Outside, standing in the cold morning with their marriage certificate, Caleb turned to Eleanor with an expression mixing satisfaction and uncertainty. I should have given you a ring. Should have made this more ceremonial somehow. We'll get rings when we can afford them. What matters is the commitment, not the symbol. Eleanor folded the certificate carefully. Besides, I prefer it this way. Honest and practical, built on partnership rather than romantic fantasy. That's stronger than any ceremony. They were climbing back into the wagon when a familiar voice called out. Turner! Mrs. Turner, I suppose I should say now. Samuel Garrett approached on foot, having apparently been conducting business elsewhere in town. His expression showed no guilt about the previous day's arson, only calculating interest in their presence. Eleanor felt Caleb tense beside her, but put a restraining hand on his arm. Mr. Garrett, she said coolly, come to survey your handiwork? See if yesterday's fire accomplished your goals? Garrett's smile was thin and dangerous. I don't know what you're implying, Mrs. Turner, though I did hear about your unfortunate barn fire. Terrible thing, these accidents that plague struggling ranches. Makes a man wonder if the land itself is cursed. The only curse on that land is having you as a neighbor. Caleb's voice was tight with controlled rage. But we're still there, Garrett, still fighting, and we're not going anywhere. We'll see about that. 24 months of quarterly payments is a long time. Lots can happen in 24 months. Garrett's eyes moved between them, assessing, calculating. But congratulations on your marriage. I'm sure it will be very educational for both of you. He walked away before either could respond, leaving implicit threats hanging in the cold air. Eleanor watched him go, her mind already analyzing the encounter. Garrett was confident, secure in his power and connections. He believed time and pressure would eventually break them regardless of today's setback. That confidence was both dangerous and potentially exploitable. He's going to keep coming at us, Caleb said quietly, every way he can think of, until something breaks. Then we need to make sure we're not the thing that breaks. Eleanor climbed into the wagon. Take me to the land office. I want to file a formal contest of that boundary dispute before the surveyor arrives. And I want to review the original land grant documents to make sure our property boundaries are absolutely clear. The land office was a cluttered space filled with maps and ledgers, presided over by a meticulous clerk named Werner, who seemed to care more about documentary precision than local politics. Eleanor explained their situation, the boundary dispute filed by Garrett, the upcoming survey, her need to contest the claim and verify their legal boundaries. Werner pulled out thick ledgers and unrolled survey maps, spreading them across a large table. The Turner property was originally granted to your husband's father in 1865, 640 acres bounded here, 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 and here. His finger traced the boundaries. The eastern fence line runs along the creek, exactly where the original survey placed it. There's no encroachment on public land. That creek and 20 feet east of it are definitely part of the Turner grant. So Garrett's claim is fraudulent? Appears to be. Though he's arguing the original survey was imprecise and should be corrected, that's technically within his rights to challenge. Werner pulled out another document. The county surveyor is scheduled to review the boundary next week. If you want to contest Garrett's claim, you need to file formal objection and be present during the survey to present your evidence. Eleanor filed the necessary papers while Werner provided certified copies of the original land grant and survey documents. Armed with this documentation, she felt more confident about defending against Garrett's boundary challenge. But the pattern was clear. Garrett was attacking from every possible angle, trying to find the weakness that would finally break them. They returned to the ranch by midday to find Martha Jensen waiting, her wagon loaded with supplies. She climbed down as they approached, her expression determined. "I've been thinking about that barn fire, about everything we lost and what it means for all of us." "Martha, I'm so sorry," Eleanor began. "All your work is gone, I know. But here's what I'm thinking. We rebuild. Not just the barn, but bigger and better. We turn this into a real operation, something that can generate steady income year-round, not just seasonal harvest work." Martha pulled out rough sketches she'd made. "I've got timber I can contribute from my property. My boys can do carpentry work. We build a proper processing facility, something that could handle not just apples but other preserves. Maybe even become a small commercial operation that serves multiple ranches." Eleanor studied the sketches, seeing the vision behind Martha's proposal. "That would require significant investment. We just committed everything we had to the bank payment. I'm not asking for money up front. I'm proposing expanded partnership. We formalize this arrangement. Turner Ranch provides facility and raw materials. I provide processing expertise and labor. We split profits 60-40 on everything we produce. Long-term commitment, mutual investment." Martha met Eleanor's eyes. "Your husband's father gave my husband work when no one else would. That's a debt I haven't forgotten. Let me help you build something that lasts." The offer was generous and strategically sound. Eleanor looked at Caleb, seeing him weighing the proposal. Finally, he extended his hand to Martha. "You've got a deal. We'll draw up formal partnership papers, make this official and legal. Thank you, Martha, for believing in this when everyone else thinks we're crazy." "Crazy's just another word for brave out here." Martha shook his hand firmly. "We start rebuilding tomorrow. I'll bring my boys and tools. You provide the labor and we'll have a new barn up in 2 weeks." After Martha left, Eleanor and Caleb stood surveying their property with new eyes. The burned barn was still a ruin, but now it represented opportunity rather than just loss. They could build something better, create real value through strategic partnership. "She's right, Caleb said. "We've been thinking too small, just trying to survive. Maybe we should be thinking about actually thriving, about building something bigger than just a struggling ranch. The quarterly payments will be easier to make if we've got diversified income streams. If we're producing preserves commercially, if we're processing for other ranches, if we're creating multiple revenue sources instead of depending entirely on cattle that can die in a hard winter." Caleb's voice gained energy as he spoke. "Eleanor, what if we approach this like you approached everything else? Strategically, looking for undervalued assets and unrealized potential?" Eleanor felt excitement kindling in her chest. This was what she did best, seeing possibilities others missed, connecting resources in innovative ways. The rocky outcrop. We never followed up with Howard Finch about the mineral survey. What if those lead zinc deposits are actually valuable? Even a small-scale mining operation could generate significant income, and the water rights, Garrett wants them so badly because they're genuinely valuable. What if we leased water access to other ranchers for a fee? Create recurring revenue from an asset we're not fully utilizing anyway. They spent the afternoon planning, Eleanor making notes and calculations while Caleb contributed practical knowledge of local conditions and needs. By evening, they had the outline of a comprehensive strategy. Rebuild the barn as a commercial processing facility, potentially develop mineral resources on the northern boundary, lease water rights to create recurring income, and diversify the cattle operation to focus on breeding stock rather than meat production. It was ambitious, maybe even grandiose given their circumstances, but ambition was what had saved them so far. That evening, sitting at their scarred kitchen table going over numbers by lamplight, Eleanor allowed herself to feel something she'd been afraid to acknowledge. Hope. Not the desperate hope that had sustained her through the crisis, but genuine optimism about building something lasting and valuable. "We're going to make this work," she said quietly. "Not just survive, but actually succeed. Build something we're proud of." Caleb reached across the table and took her hand. "We already have, Eleanor. We've built a partnership that's survived everything thrown at it. The ranch is just the physical manifestation." The next week blurred into intense activity as they rebuilt with help from Martha's family and a few neighbors who'd heard about the arson and wanted to express solidarity. The new barn rose quickly, larger and better ventilated than the old structure. designed specifically for food processing with proper storage areas and workstations. It wasn't finished, but it was functional enough to resume operations. Meanwhile, Eleanor commissioned Finch to conduct his mineral survey of the rocky outcrop, $50 borrowed against future apple harvest income. If the deposit proved valuable, that $50 would be the best investment they'd ever made. If not, they'd absorbed the loss and moved on. The boundary survey happened on a cold Wednesday morning, with Eleanor and Caleb present along with Samuel Garrett and a territorial surveyor named Peterson, who looked supremely uninterested in the political dimensions of his work. He simply reviewed the original land grant, walked the disputed boundary with his equipment, and made precise measurements. "The fence is exactly where the 1865 survey placed it," Peterson announced after 2 hours of careful work. 23 feet west of the creek's high water mark, well within the granted property boundaries. There's no encroachment on public land and no basis for boundary adjustment. Garrett's jaw tightened. The original survey could have been imprecise. The original survey was conducted by the Territorial Land Office using standard procedures. Unless you have evidence of specific errors, which you don't, the boundary stands as marked. Peterson packed his equipment. "I'll file my report with the Land Office. The boundary dispute is resolved in favor of the existing property lines." Garrett stared at Eleanor and Caleb with barely controlled rage, clearly having expected the survey to support his claim or at least create enough ambiguity for continued legal challenges. Instead, he'd been definitively defeated on public record. "This isn't over," he said quietly. "Yes, it is," Eleanor replied. "You've lost the foreclosure battle. You've lost the boundary dispute. You've committed arson that we've documented. Every move you make against us now just adds to the evidence file we're maintaining. How much do you think the Territorial Banking Commission will care when they see the full pattern? You think some investigation in Lincoln scares me? I have friends, had friends, past tense." Eleanor pulled out a letter she'd received that morning. "This is from Commissioner Aldridge. The Banking Commission has concluded their preliminary investigation and found sufficient evidence of improper foreclosure practices to warrant formal disciplinary action against First Territorial Bank. Cyrus Blackwood is being censured and the bank is under enhanced regulatory oversight. Your friend's power just got significantly reduced." She was bluffing slightly. The letter confirmed the investigation's continuation, but didn't detail specific findings. But Garrett didn't know that, and the mention of enhanced oversight was enough to shake his confidence. "Furthermore," Eleanor continued, "I've been in contact with 3 other ranchers you've targeted. We're discussing collective legal action to recover damages for the systematic harassment and predatory practices you and Blackwood have coordinated. You're facing potential civil liability that could cost you far more than our little ranch is worth." This was more than bluff. She had been talking to Henderson and others, exploring their options. Collective action was complicated and expensive, but the threat of it had strategic value even if execution was uncertain. Garrett stared at her, clearly recalculating. He'd expected to face a desperate rancher and his naive Eastern bride. Instead, he was facing organized opposition that understood how to use legal and regulatory systems as weapons. The power dynamic had shifted in ways he hadn't anticipated. "You've made an enemy, Mrs. Turner," he said finally. "That's going to cost you in ways you can't predict. I'd rather have you as an honest enemy than a false friend. At least this way, I know where the threat comes from." Eleanor turned toward the wagon. "Good day, Mr. Garrett. I'm sure we'll see each other again, probably in a courtroom." As they drove away, Caleb let out a long breath. "You were magnificent. Terrifying, but magnificent. Did you really mean all that about collective legal action?" "Some of it. Enough to make him worry about fighting a broader war rather than just targeting us." Eleanor allowed herself a small smile. "He's dangerous, but he's also cautious. He built his empire through calculated risks, not reckless aggression. If we make targeting us too expensive and too risky, he'll eventually decide we're not worth the effort." 2 weeks later, Howard Finch delivered his mineral survey report. Eleanor and Caleb read it together at the kitchen table, hardly daring to breathe as they worked through the technical language and geological assessments. The northern outcrop shows significant lead-zinc mineralization extending approximately 40 feet deep and covering roughly 3 acres of surface area, Eleanor read aloud. Estimated reserves suggest commercial viability for small-scale mining operations. Conservative valuation of extractable ore ranges between $8,000 and $12,000 at current market prices. They stared at each other in stunned silence. $12,000. That was more than 10 times what they owed the bank, enough to not only pay off the restructured debt immediately, but to invest in significant ranch improvements and still have capital remaining. "This changes everything," Caleb whispered. "Eleanor, we're not fighting to survive anymore. We're suddenly sitting on genuine wealth. Potential wealth. We'd need to develop mining operations, extract the ore, process it, find buyers. That takes time and investment." But Eleanor's mind was already racing through possibilities. However, the proven reserves have immediate value. We could potentially use them as collateral for better loan terms, or sell mining rights to an established operation, or lease the deposit for royalty payments. Over the next month, they pursued all three options simultaneously. Eleanor contacted mining companies operating in the territory, presenting Finch's survey and inviting bids for mining rights. She negotiated with Blackwood to restructure their debt terms based on the proven mineral assets, and she explored the possibility of developing their own small-scale mining operation using borrowed equipment and hired expertise. The bids that came back were staggering. A company from Denver offered $3,500 for a 5-year mining lease with 15% royalties on extracted ore. A smaller local operation offered to develop the mine in partnership, splitting costs and profits equally. And a speculator offered $6,000 to purchase the mineral rights outright. Eleanor presented all options to Caleb over dinner one evening, both of them still adjusting to the reality that their desperate situation had transformed into genuine opportunity. The lease gives us immediate capital and ongoing income. The partnership splits risk, but also splits profits. Selling outright gives us maximum capital now, but no future income from the resource. What do you think we should do? I think we take the Denver lease. $3,500 upfront plus royalties gives us immediate security and ongoing income. We pay off the bank debt completely, no more quarterly payments hanging over us. We invest in ranch improvements that increase productivity, and we bank reserves for inevitable future crises. Eleanor met his eyes across the table. "We've been living crisis to crisis since I arrived. The mineral lease lets us finally get ahead of circumstances instead of constantly reacting to them." Caleb nodded slowly. "You're right. Security first, then growth. Let's do it." The mining lease negotiation took 2 weeks of careful contract review with Matthias Cole, ensuring their interests were protected. But finally, on a cold December morning, Eleanor signed the papers that transferred mining rights to Rocky Mountain Minerals Company for 5 years in exchange for $3,500 and 15% royalties on all extracted ore. The check felt impossibly large in her hands, representing more money than she'd ever personally controlled. She and Caleb walked directly to First Territorial Bank, where a visibly uncomfortable Cyrus Blackwood processed their payment of the entire remaining debt balance, $585 after accounting for their initial payment and accrued interest. "This settles our account in full," Eleanor said, watching Blackwood stamp paid across their loan documents. "We'll take receipt showing zero balance and release of all liens on ranch property." Blackwood provided the documents silently, clearly aware that the power dynamic had permanently shifted. They'd defeated his foreclosure attempt, exposed his corrupt practices, and now paid off the debt entirely. He had no leverage over them anymore, and the enhanced regulatory oversight meant he couldn't easily target other victims the way he'd targeted the Turners. Walking out of that bank with clear title to their property felt like emerging from underwater, finally able to breathe freely after weeks of suffocation. They were free. Truly, completely free of the debt that had threatened everything. "What now?" Caleb asked as they stood on the Grand Island street, freed from the burden they'd carried so long it had become part of their identity. "Now we build," Eleanor said simply. "We turn that struggling ranch into something genuinely successful. We help Martha establish her commercial processing operation. We develop additional income streams. We become the success story instead of the cautionary tale." The winter that followed was hard but productive. With the mining company beginning extraction operations on the northern boundary and paying monthly royalties, the Turners had steady income to supplement cattle revenue. Martha's processing facility became operational, producing preserves that developed a reputation for quality throughout the territory. The ranch itself, freed from crushing debt and infused with capital for improvements, began to show genuine profit. Eleanor threw herself into ranch management with the same intensity she'd brought to fighting the foreclosure. She negotiated water rights leases with 3 neighboring ranchers, creating recurring revenue from an underutilized asset. She diversified their cattle operation to focus on breeding stock, selling young bulls to other ranches at premium prices. She even established a small lending operation, using their excess capital to provide short-term loans to other struggling ranchers at fair interest rates, helping others while generating additional income. Caleb managed the physical operations with renewed energy, no longer fighting alone but working as part of a coordinated strategy. The cattle thrived under improved management. The pastures recovered from years of overgrazing. The buildings were repaired and maintained properly. The ranch transformed from desperate survival to genuine prosperity. By spring, the mining royalties alone covered their monthly expenses. The cattle operation generated solid profit. Martha's processing facility was expanding to handle products from 5 different ranches, and the lending operation had become a small but respectable financial service, helping other ranchers avoid the predatory practices that had nearly destroyed the Turners. Samuel Garrett watched this transformation with evident frustration but made no further aggressive moves. The collective legal action Eleanor had threatened never materialized. The other victims were too intimidated or too broken to join the fight. But Garrett knew the Turners had documentation of his past actions and connections to regulators who'd proven willing to investigate corruption. The risk of attacking them again outweighed any potential benefit. In June, Eleanor discovered she was pregnant. The realization came one morning as she reviewed account books and felt sudden, overwhelming nausea that had nothing to do with the numbers. She sat very still, processing this new development, this unexpected complication to their carefully managed plans. Caleb found her there an hour later, still sitting with her hand on her stomach, expression unreadable. "Eleanor, what's wrong?" "Nothing's wrong. Everything's different." She looked up at him. "I'm pregnant. We're going to have a child." His expression cycled through shock, joy, fear, and finally settled on wonder. "A baby. We're going to be parents." Apparently, Eleanor tried to match his wonder but felt mostly terrified. She'd fought banks and corrupt officials and arson and drought. But somehow the prospect of motherhood seemed more daunting than all of it. "I don't know how to be a mother, Caleb. I've spent my whole life avoiding domestic expectations, focusing on business and strategy. What if I'm terrible at it?" "You've built a successful ranch operation from nothing, exposed systematic corruption, and defeated powerful men who underestimated you. If you can do all that, you can figure out parenthood." Caleb knelt beside her chair, taking her hands. "And you won't be doing it alone. We're partners, remember? In everything." The pregnancy progressed through summer and into fall, Eleanor stubbornly continuing to manage ranch operations until the physical realities of late pregnancy made it impossible. She trained Martha to handle more of the administrative work, taught Caleb the bookkeeping system she'd established, and prepared for transition with the same strategic thinking she brought to every challenge. Their daughter was born in February during a brutal snowstorm that trapped them at the ranch, with only Martha Jensen serving as midwife. The labor was long and agonizing, Eleanor discovering that no amount of strategic planning prepared you for the raw physical reality of childbirth. But when the baby finally arrived, screaming her fury at being forced into the cold world, Eleanor felt something shift fundamentally inside her. They named her Sarah, after Caleb's mother who'd planted the apple orchard that had helped save the ranch. Sarah Turner, born into prosperity that her parents had created through sheer desperate determination. Holding her daughter in the quiet hours after birth, Eleanor reflected on the journey that had brought her here. 10 months ago, she'd arrived in Nebraska expecting to be a mail-order bride, hoping for security and perhaps companionship. Instead, she'd found partnership, purpose, and a love built on mutual respect and shared struggle. The ranch that had been failing when she arrived now thrived. The debt that had threatened foreclosure was paid in full. The enemies who'd tried to crush them had been defeated or rendered harmless. And the desperate strangers who'd come together out of necessity had become genuine partners in every sense, building a life and now a family together. "What are you thinking?" Caleb asked from where he sat nearby, watching his wife and newborn daughter with expression of profound contentment. "I'm thinking that I came to Nebraska looking for security and found something far more valuable." I found the chance to become the person I was always capable of being, but never had opportunity to become back east. Eleanor looked down at Sarah's sleeping face, so small and vulnerable and full of potential. I'm thinking that she'll grow up knowing that women can be strong and capable and strategic, that partnership means equality, not submission, that impossible odds are just opportunities for creative thinking. You're going to teach her all that? I'm going to show her by example, the way you've shown me that good men exist who see women as equals rather than possessions or decorations. Eleanor met his eyes. Caleb, do you remember what you wrote in that first letter? You said you could offer me a home, security, and partnership in building something lasting. I remember. Seems almost naive now, given what actually happened. You delivered on every promise. This ranch is home. We have security. Not just financial, but the security of knowing we can handle whatever crisis comes. And we've built something lasting, something that will outlive us. Eleanor smiled. You were a man of your word, Caleb Turner. That's rarer than you know. You were the miracle I didn't know how to ask for. I thought I needed a wife who could cook and clean and manage a household. Instead, I got a warrior who could fight battles I didn't know needed fighting, who could see possibilities I was too defeated to see. Caleb moved closer, carefully avoiding disturbing the sleeping baby. Eleanor, I love you, not just for saving the ranch, but for being exactly who you are, brilliant, fierce, stubborn, and absolutely refusing to accept defeat as inevitable. I love you too, for being strong enough to accept help, wise enough to trust my judgment even when it seemed crazy, and honest enough to admit when you were drowning instead of pretending everything was fine. Eleanor shifted Sarah slightly, the baby making small, contented noises. We're going to be good parents, Caleb. Maybe not perfect, but good. Because we'll teach her to fight for what she believes in, to see opportunity in crisis, and to never accept that impossible means something can't be done. Spring arrived with its usual dramatic transformation of the prairie, brown grass giving way to green, the creek swelling with snowmelt, the land awakening to new possibility. The mining operation on the northern boundary had proven even more valuable than Finch predicted, royalty checks arriving monthly that exceeded Eleanor's most optimistic projections. Martha's processing facility was thriving, now employing 6 workers and producing preserves sold throughout the territory. In May, Commissioner Aldridge visited the ranch personally, making rounds to properties affected by the banking corruption investigation. He walked the land with Eleanor and Caleb, inspected the improvements, and reviewed the financial records showing the ranch's transformation from near failure to solid profitability. You've accomplished something remarkable here, Aldridge said as they sat on the porch of the house that no longer sagged, drinking coffee from cups that weren't chipped. Not just surviving, but building genuine prosperity. The Banking Commission's final report is going to include your case as primary evidence that our intervention was necessary and effective. What happened to Blackwood? Eleanor asked, bouncing Sarah on her knee. He's no longer president of First Territorial Bank. The bank itself is under new management, with strict regulatory oversight. Several of the worst foreclosures have been reversed or restructured. Thomas Henderson got his property back. The foreclosure was ruled improper and voided. Aldridge smiled at Eleanor's expression of satisfaction. Your investigation and testimony were instrumental in achieving those outcomes, Mrs. Turner. You helped a lot of families beyond just your own. After Aldridge left, Eleanor sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the prairie in familiar gold and crimson. Sarah slept in her arms, Caleb sat beside her, and in the distance she could see cattle grazing on good grass, the new barn standing solid and permanent, the land itself showing the care they'd invested in it. I was thinking, Caleb said quietly, about next spring, about expanding the cattle operation, maybe building a proper bunkhouse so we can hire full-time ranch hands, about planting more of those apple trees. The orchard could be twice the size with proper management. Ambitious. I like it. Eleanor shifted Sarah carefully. Though we should also think about education. Sarah's going to need schooling eventually, and the nearest school is 10 miles away. What if we established a small school here, brought in other ranch families' children? We've got the resources now to invest in community infrastructure. Always thinking 3 moves ahead. Caleb smiled. That's what I love about you. You're never satisfied with just solving the immediate problem. You're always looking for ways to build something bigger and more lasting. They sat in comfortable silence, watching their land transform in the fading light. A year ago, Eleanor had stood in almost this exact spot, looking at ruins and impossibility, wondering if she'd made the worst mistake of her life coming to Nebraska. Now she sat holding her daughter beside the man she loved, on land they'd saved through intelligence and courage and absolute refusal to surrender. The frontier was still harsh. Winter would still test them. Drought might come again, or disease, or any of the 100 disasters that plagued ranch life. But they'd proven they could survive crisis, could turn defeat into victory, could build prosperity from desperation. And they'd done it together, two people who'd been strangers brought together by circumstance, who'd forged partnership in fire and emerged stronger than either could have been alone. "Thank you," Eleanor said quietly. "For what?" "For writing that advertisement. For being honest about the situation instead of pretending things were fine. For accepting me as an equal partner instead of expecting submission. For building this life with me." Eleanor leaned against his shoulder. "A year ago, I was a disappointed spinster in Philadelphia with no prospects and no future. You gave me the chance to become someone I'm proud of being. You gave yourself that chance. I just provided the opportunity. Everything else, the strategy, the courage, the refusal to quit, that was all you, Eleanor." Caleb put his arm around her shoulders. "You saved this ranch. You saved me. And you built something that's going to last long after we're gone." Sarah stirred in Eleanor's arms, opening her eyes briefly before settling back into sleep. In that moment, Eleanor saw their future. This child growing up strong and capable on land her parents had fought to save, learning that intelligence and determination could overcome impossible odds, seeing her mother as equal partner in building prosperity rather than subordinate dependent. The prairie wind sang its eternal song across the darkening land, but for once it didn't sound like threat or warning. It sounded like possibility, like promise, like the voice of a land that rewarded those brave enough and stubborn enough to believe in it. Eleanor Turner sat on the porch of her ranch holding her daughter, beside the husband who'd become her truest partner, surrounded by evidence of what they'd built together. The mail-order bride who'd arrived expecting nothing had found everything: purpose, partnership, prosperity, and love forged in the fires of impossible struggle. She'd come to Nebraska to survive. Instead, she'd learned to thrive. And as the stars began to emerge in the vast prairie sky, Eleanor allowed herself to feel something she'd been too afraid to acknowledge through all the fighting and crisis and desperate maneuvering. She was happy. Genuinely, profoundly happy with this life they'd created, this partnership they'd forged, this future they were building together. The impossible fight was over. They'd won not just survival but triumph, not just security but success. The ranch that had been dying when she arrived now thrived. The debt that had threatened foreclosure was paid and forgotten. The enemies who'd tried to crush them were defeated. And two people who'd been desperate strangers had become family, bound together by shared struggle and mutual respect and love that had grown slowly through crisis into something unshakable. The frontier had tested Eleanor Hayes and forged her into Eleanor Turner, someone stronger and more capable than she'd ever imagined becoming. And this harsh Nebraska land that had seemed so alien and hostile had become home, the place where she'd discovered who she truly was and what she was capable of achieving. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. The work would never truly end. That was the nature of ranch life, of frontier existence, of building something from wilderness. But tomorrow they'd face those challenges together, partners in every sense, confident in their ability to handle whatever came. Tonight, they sat together in the peaceful evening, watching the land they'd saved, holding the future they'd created, and remembering the impossible journey that had brought them here. From desperate strangers to true partners, from certain failure to genuine triumph, from the edge of destruction to the beginning of something lasting and valuable and good. And as darkness settled fully over the Turner Ranch, the lights burned warm in the house that stood solid and permanent, testament to the truth that sometimes, in the harsh frontier where survival itself was victory, determination and intelligence and partnership could rewrite destiny and transform impossible dreams into remarkable reality.